Ever see something you know is impossible? I don't mean a trick of the light. I mean a symbol drawn in the dust on your passenger door while you're doing 70 down a deserted mountain pass. I wiped it away. And it came back. Dispatch said I was probably exhausted. Seeing patterns in the road. It's easy to believe that when you're safe in a lit office. But they weren't the one who had to pull alone in the dark, alone in the knowing whatever drew it was still. This story is the reason I don't drive anymore. You hear it. And then decide for yourself what was real and what was just a tired man's nightmare. There's a certain kind of peace you can only find in the cab of an 18-wheeler. I don't mean a trick 10 hours into a 14-hour symbol drawn in the dust on your passenger door while you're doing 70 rumbling meditation mountain pass. The hum of the Cummins engine is your mantra. And it came back. The rhythmic thump of the tires on the expansion joints is your seeing patterns in the road. And the endless ribbon of asphalt. It's easy to believe that when you're safe to a lit office. But they weren't the one who had to pull over your path to Grand Junction, Colorado, knowing whatever with a reefer full of Washington apples. This story is the reason I don't drive anymore. You hear for 22 years, and then decide for yourself what was my religion and what was just a tired man's. It's what I trusted. Ever see something you know? A midnight blue Kenworth. I don't mean a trick 900i called. I mean a symbol drawn in my home on your passenger brick and mortar place I ever paid 70 down. This particular run was cake. I wiped it away. 70 westbound. It came back. Climbing out of Denver said I was into the heart of the Rockies. It was late October. The tourist season was long. It's easy to believe that when you're safe, the snows hadn't choked. But they weren't the one who had to pull over. It was just me, alone in the mountains, and a knowing whatever lonely soul was pushing through the night. This story, the moon was a fat, silver dollar. You hear it, sky, and then decide for yourself you could see the dust of the Milky Way. And what was just a tired man's. I had my coffee. Ever see some country station crackling softly on I don't mean a trick of the light. And my logbook was as clean as a drawn in the dust on your passenger door. For a long-haul trucker, didn't get much better. Mountain pass. I was feeling good. I wiped it away. Making good time. And it came back. I just passed the Eisenhower tunnel. I was probably starting the long, seeing patterns in the descent towards Vail. It's easy to believe that when you're safe in a lit office. The pines thicker. But they weren't the world outside my windows was a alone in the dark, silent, knowing whatever drone was still shadow. That's when the first crack appeared in the perfect, boring reality you hear it, night. And then decide for yourself what was real, not with the usual friendly tired man's night. The bare reports. Ever see something you know from others impossible? This I don't mean a trick of the light. It was a single sharp burst of drawn in the dust on your passenger door while you're doing 70 down. It was low and raspy. I wiped it away. Dry leaves and it came back across pavement. Dispatch said I was so faint, exhausted. I almost dismissed it as a stray signal. It's easy to believe that when you're safe in a lit office. Cold night for apples. But they weren't the one who had to pull over. I frowned, alone in the dark. My hand tightened, knowing whatever drew it. My blood went a little cool. This story is the reason I don't drive anymore. Lots of us all produce, and then decide for yourself what was real, the way it cut and what was just a tired man's nightmare. I scanned my mirrors. Ever see something you know? The road behind me was empty. I don't mean a trick, at least a mile. I mean just a symbol snake-like drawn in the dust on your passenger disappearing while you're doing 70 down a deserted nothing but the twin beams of my headlights carving and it came back through the darkness. Dispatch said I was grabbed my mic exhausted. Yeah, seeing patterns in the road. I said trying to sound casual. It's easy to believe that when you're safe. Who's on this channel? But they weren't the one who had to just the low hum of my own radio. Alone in the dark. I waited a full knowing whatever drew it was still. I shook my head. This story is the reason I don't drive. Get a grip, Frank. You hear muttered to myself, and then decide for yourself what was real by the wind and what was just for the next 20 minutes. Everything. Ever see something you know is a country singer on the radio. I don't mean a trick of crooning about lost. I mean a symbol. The engine maintained on your passenger drum while you're doing 70 down a deserted mountain pass. I convinced myself I'd imagined it, and it came back. That it was some amateur with a weak said I was probably exhausted, seeing that patterns in the road grind. The CB crackled. It's easy to believe that when you're safe in a lit office. The whisper was back, but they weren't the one who had to pull over, closer, alone in the dark. She misses you. The voice knowing whatever drew it was the letters you send. This story is the reason I don't drive. The one with the painted roses. You hear it. And this time for yourself, coffee in my stomach, and what was just a tired man's. My daughter, Sarah, ever see something you know exactly like that on her dresser? I don't mean a trick. I'd given it to her for her 16th birthday, drawn in the dust on your passenger door. It was a silly, sentimental little thing, but she loved it. No one knew about that box, and it came back. Not my ex-wife. Dispatch. Not my dispatcher. Exhausted. Not a single soul on this earth who could possibly be on this stretch of I-70 at this hour. It's easy to believe that when you're safe in a lit office. My heart started. But they weren't the one who had to pull over, alone, a frantic drumbeat against the steady whatever drew it of the diesel engine. This story is the reason this wasn't a coincidence anymore. The comfortable solitude and then decide for yourself suddenly felt like a cage, and what was just a tiny, nightmare. Fragile bubble. Ever see something you know is predatory darkness? I don't mean a trick of the light. My professionalism. I mean a symbol. 2 decades drawn in the dust on your passenger screamed at me while you're doing 70 down a deserted mountain pass. But the father in me was screaming much, and it came back much louder. Dispatch. I needed to stop. Probably exhausted. I needed to think. Seeing patterns. My mind was racing. Trying to easy to believe that when you're safe in a lit office. Who could this be? But they weren't the one who had to pull. Was my daughter in trouble? Alone in the dark. My hands were slick with sweat. Knowing whatever drew was still out there. Up ahead, this story I saw the reason sign I don't drive scenic overlook. You hear it doesn't scatter. Decide for yourself what was real. It would be deserted at this time. Tire man's night. Perfect. I needed to get out of the driver's seat. Walk around, clear my head. I don't mean a trick of the light. A safety check. I mean a symbol. That's what I'd log it as. Drawn in the dust. Just a standard check of the rig while you're doing 70 down. It was a perfectly logical, professional decision. I wiped it away. Pulling over for 5 minutes to get my bearings. Said I was probably exhausted. Flicking on my turn signal, patterns in the road. I geared down. It's easy to believe that when you're safe to life in a lit office, echoing off. But they weren't the one who had to pull the big rig slow, alone in the dark, turning off the main highway, whatever drew, and crunching onto the gravel of the empty. This story is the place was I don't drive anymore. I cut the engine and the headlights, and then decide for yourself, plunging myself into an unnerving silence, broken only by the ticking something you know is impossible. I sat there for a long moment. I mean a symbol coiling drawn in the dust on your passenger door. I was letting some psycho with a radio get deserted mountain, but I had to be sure. I wiped it away, check, and it came back. The heavy door open. Said I was probably exhausted. The mountain air was thin and sharp. It's easy to believe that when you're safe, I walked the length of the trailer, but they weren't the one who had tires with my boot alone in the dark. Habit. Everything looked fine. Drew, it was the reefer unit was humming along. Is the reason I don't drive anymore. I walked around in front of the cab. And then decide for yourself scattering real stones and what was just a tire. The moonlight glinted off. Ever see something you know? It all looked impossible. I felt a wave of relief. I mean a symbol surge drawn in the dust on your passenger. I let my imagination run 70 down. I turned to climb back into the cab. I wiped away, reaching for the door, and it came back. And that's when I saw it. Said I was probably there on the passenger side door, seeing patterns in the thick layer of road dust. It's easy to believe that when you're safe, freshly drawn symbol. But they weren't the one who had to pull. It was a shape. An hourglass lying on its side. Knowing whatever drew my breath caught in my throat. This story is the reason I don't drive. The world seemed to shrink to that, and then decide for yourself what was real and what was just an hourglass on side. It wasn't ever see something you know is impossible. The lines were too. I don't mean a trick of the light. Too deliberate. I mean a symbol as if drawn by a dust on your passenger calm while you're doing 70 down for a second. I was frozen. I wiped it away. My mind refusing to process. Dispatch said I was probably exhausted. I hadn't been stopped seeing patterns in the road grime. I had walked around to believe that when you're safe, no one was here. The overlook was the one who had to pull over, hanging over in the 1,000-foot drop, knowing whatever drew it was still out there. There were no hiding places, no other cars, no sound but the wind. You hear it and the ticking of my engine. And then decide for yourself what was real, cold, and what was just a tire man's finally broke the spell. Ever see something you know is impossible? I just reacted. I don't mean a trick of the light. Shot out. I mean I smeared the symbol drawn in the dust on your passenger jacket. While you're doing wiping frantically until the dust was just a meaningless smudge. I wiped it away, and it came back. My heart was a wild bird. Said I was probably exhausted. Seeing I scrambled back up into the cab. It's easy to believe that when you're safe with a lit office. The click of the bolt, but they weren't the one who had to pull over, no comfort, alone in the dark. My hand was shaking, whatever drew it was badly. It took me to. This story tries to get the reason back. I don't drive anymore. The Cummins engine roared and then decide for yourself the sound of angry protest. What was just a tire man's nightmare. I didn't ever see something you know is impossible. I slammed the shifter into gear and stomped on the accelerator, drawn in the dust, a shower of gravel while you're doing 70 as the mule lurches back onto the highway. I wiped it away 50 miles, and it came back. I drove like a rookie running. Said I was probably exhausted. My eyes were glued to my mirrors, scanning the darkness behind that when you're safe in a lit office for any sign. But they weren't the one who had to pull. There was nothing alone in the road. Remained stubbornly, whatever terrifyingly out there. My story is the reason I don't drive. It was a storm of terrified speculation, and then decide for yourself what was real. It had to be a person, and what was just a tire man's night. Ghosts don't draw in. Ever see something you know? My brain is impossible. Seasoned by decades. I don't mean a trick of dealing with tangible problems. I mean a symbol blown drawn in the dust on your passenger door. Highway closures, 70 down. Refused to accept any other possibility. I wiped it away. It started building and it came back. Story. Dispatch. Rationalization. I could cling to like a seeing patterns in the road grime. It was another trucker. It's easy to believe some sicko who gets his kicks, tormenting guys. But they weren't the one who had to pull over. He must have a heavily modified CB, knowing whatever something with serious range. This story was parked somewhere off-road, I don't drive hidden in the pines, you hear watching the highway, and then decide for yourself what was into the overlook and what was just while I was on the driver's side, distracted, ever see something tires, he must have sprinted out of the darkness. I don't mean a trick of the light. I mean a symbol and drawn in the dust under the passenger door I came while you're doing 70. It was a huge risk on his part, but that's what made him dangerous. I wiped it away. And it came back. Thrill seeker. Dispatch. The whisper about my daughter. Exhausted. He must have researched me. Patterns. It's not hard these days. It's easy to believe that when you're safe in a lit office. A determined weirdo. But they weren't the one who had to pull over. It was a terrifying thought, but it was a knowing whatever drew it was. It meant my enemy was flesh. This story is the reason, and flesh and blood can be avoided. You hear it. Flesh and decide for yourself what was real. This explanation, flimsy as it was, ever see something you know is impossible. It was a false comfort, trick of the light. A lie. I mean a symbol, so I can keep my hand on your passenger door while you're doing 70 down. You're not losing your mind. You're being targeted. I wiped it away. The new plan was came back. Don't stop for anything. Said I was probably exhausted. Get to Grand Junction. Seeing patterns. It was a big town. The last major stop. It's easy to believe that when you're safe in a lit office into Utah. But they weren't the one who had lights, to pull cops, cameras in the dark, and dozens of other knowing whatever drew it. There's safety in numbers. This story I feel the reason. Grab a coffee inside a bright lit building, and then decide for never get more than 10 feet from what was just a tire man's nightmare. I'd be in and out in 20 minutes. Ever see something you know is impossible. This guy, this stalker. I don't mean a trick of the light. He wouldn't dare. I mean a symbol in a crowded drawn in the dust on your passenger door. By clinging to this false explanation, I believed I was making the smart, I wiped it away, and it came back. I was taking control of the situation. Said I was probably exhausted. The miles rolled by, seeing the jagged peaks of the high Rockies. It's easy to believe that when you're safe in a canyons of the western, but they weren't the one who had to. The moon remained my silent companion. In the dark. The CB stayed whatever quiet. Drew it was still. The further I drove, this story is the reason. The more the raw terror faded. You hear it, replaced by. And then decide for yourself what was real and what was just a. I felt a little foolish, but cautious. Ever see something you know? My prankster theory was holding up. I don't mean a trick of the light. I passed a green sign. I mean a symbol. Grand Junction drawn in the dust on your passenger door. Almost there. While you're doing. I allowed myself a small breath of relief. I checked my mirrors again, and it came back. A habit that was dispatched said I was probably exhausted. The road behind me was seeing patterns in the road, empty void. It's easy to believe that when my gaze drifted to my passenger side mirror, but they weren't the one who had to pull one angle down to watch my front tire, knowing whatever drew it was still. The moonlight caught the surface of the reason I don't illuminating the thin film of grime, and then decide for yourself what was real. The smudge where I'd wiped away the symbol was still. Ever see something you know? But it wasn't just a smudge anymore. I don't mean a trick of a fine layer of. I mean a symbol that it's drawn in the dust on your passenger door while you're doing 70 down. But it was there. The clean, I wiped away lines of an hour, and it came back. Lying on its side, said I was probably exhausted. The truck patterns in the road, my whole body jerking. It's easy to believe that when you're safe, the tires screamed for a split second. But they weren't the one who had to fall over. I corrected. Alone in the dark, my knuckles white, knowing whatever drew it was still. I stared into the mirror. This story is the reason I don't drive. It couldn't be. It was a trick of the light, and then decide for yourself what was real and what was just a tired brain playing games with me. Ever see something you know hard is impossible. Trying to clear my vision. I don't mean a trick of the light. Try to force the image to dissolve, drawn in the dust on your passenger swirl of dirt while you're doing 70 down. The hourglass was there. I wiped it away into the grime, and it came back. If it had never been wiped away. Said I was probably exhausted. A brand on my rig's flame. Seeing patterns. My carefully constructed wall. It's easy to believe that when you're safe in a lit crumbles into dust. But they weren't the one. This wasn't a prankster hiding in the trees, alone in the dark. No human knowing whatever drew it was. The symbol had reappeared. This story is the reason 70 miles an hour down. You hear it, interstate, and then decide for yourself what was real. Suffocating feeling from the overlook came rushing back. Ever see something you know is impossible. The cap. I don't mean a trick of the light. Was no longer. A symbol. It had been drawn in the dust in a way I couldn't comprehend. While you're doing 70 the enemy wasn't just on the road with me. He was in my space, on my truck, and it came back, leaving his mark. Dispatch said I was probably dispatcher's voice echoed in my seeing head. Patterns. Whatever you do, Frank, it's easy to believe that when you're safe, those apples are grade A, but they weren't the one who had to pull over. They can't get warm. The contract, the cargo, the job. It was all dissolving. Reason meaning I don't drive anymore. My world had contracted, and then decide for yourself what was real and what was just a tired man's nightmare. But how do you escape something you know on your door impossible? I don't mean a trick to get off this cursed highway. I mean a symbol up ahead drawn in the dust on your exit sign for Palisade. While you're doing 70 a small farming town just east of Grand Junction. I wiped it away for its peaches, and it came back. It wasn't my plan stop. Said I was my plan was shot to hell anyway. Seeing patterns. The sign also promised gas. It's easy to believe that when you're safe, it was a deviation, but they weren't the one who had to pull over. My stalker. My hunter was expecting me to go whatever drew it was still 24/7 truck stop. This story is the reason. It's what any trucker would do. By taking this exit, I can decide for yourself what find a small local motel, just a park the rig where I could see it from my window. Ever see something you know called it's impossible? Tell them. I don't mean a trick of the light. What? I mean, if someone was drawn in the dust on your passenger door, they'd laugh me off the phone. 70 down a deserted I had to handle this myself. I wiped it away. My plan felt desperate, and it came back. But it was the only thing I could say. I was probably exhausted. I get off the interstate, seeing patterns in a public place, and then try to figure out. It's easy to believe that when you're safe, staying on I-70 felt like staying. But they weren't the one who had to pull. The hunter knew my path, alone in the dark. I had to change it, knowing the exit ramp curved down into the. This story is the reason I don't drive. The contrast with the vast, dark, decide for yourself what was real and what was just a streetlights cast a warm. Ever see something you know over neat little houses? I don't mean a trick of the orchards that stretched out into the dark, drawn in the dust on your passenger door. Normal. Doing 70 I saw a sign for a place called the Peachtree Inn. I wiped classic L-shaped roadside dispatch said I was probably exhausted. It was seeing patterns in the road. Small, unassuming. It's easy to believe the rig across the street and a lot of the closed down. But they weren't the one who had to pull in over. The air brakes hissing loudly, knowing whatever drew it was still out there. I killed the engine. This story, but this time I didn't turn off the lights. I don't drive anymore. I left my high beams on and then decided directly at the passenger side of my cab. And what was just a tired man's nightmare. I jumped down. Ever see something you know crunching on the gravel? I don't mean a trick of the light. I mean, my hands are shaking, drawn in the dust on your passenger door to be still. While you're doing 70 I approached the passenger door like it was a venomous snake. I wiped it away. Under the glare of the headlights, dispatch said I was probably exhausted. Not a ghostly image seeing patterns in the sharp and clear. It's easy to believe that when you're safe in a lit office. I reached out a trembling finger. But they weren't the one who had to pull over. It was just dust. In the dark. It smeared on my whatever drew it was still out there and real. This story is the reason my phone buzzed in my pocket. The vibration was so unexpected. And then decide for yourself what was real. I fumbled for it, my heart pounding. An unknown number. Ever see something you know? I almost didn't answer. Impossible. But the thought that it could be Sarah. I mean, something might have happened. Drawn in the dust on your passenger door while you're doing 70. I said my voice hoarse. There was a pause. I wiped it away, filled with the faint sound of static. Dispatch said I was probably exhausted. Then, seeing patterns same dry, rasping whisper. It's easy to believe it wasn't coming from distance in a lit office. It was right there inside my ear, intimate, alone in the terrifyingly close. Knowing whatever drew. You took the wrong exit, Frank. This wave of nausea is the reason I don't drive anymore. I spun around. You hear it. And then decide for yourself what was real and what was the shuttered windows of the diner. Ever see something you know is impossible? The town wasn't a sanctuary. I mean, it was just a different part of the drawn in the dust. The voice wasn't on the CB anymore. While you're doing 70 it was on my phone. Down he had my number. He knew where I was. I wiped it away. I tried to be clever. To deviate said I was probably exhausted and it hadn't patterns in the road. My little detour. It's easy to believe that when you're safe, it had been a move he'd anticipated. But they weren't the one who had to pull over. He was toying with me. Alone in the dark. My fingers knowing whatever drew it was still out there. I felt a crushing sense. This story is the reason I don't drive. My truck, my lifeline, you hear it. And my communications were compromised, and what was my every move was being watched by ever see something you know was always one step ahead. I don't mean a trick of the light. I stood there under the sterile glow of my drawn in the dust on your passenger door. A devastating realization 70 hit down. I hadn't let him hear. I hadn't made a mistake he could exploit. And it came back. The closed down diner said I was probably exhausted. The quiet seeing patterns in the road. This wasn't a random place. It's easy to believe that when you're safe, this was where he had wanted me to be. But they weren't the one who had to pull over. The quiet of the sleeping town in the dark suddenly felt knowing whatever drew it the warm yellow street lights. This story no longer seemed I don't drive anymore. They felt like spotlights on a stage. And then decide for yourself every darkened window and what was every house was a potential pair of eyes. Ever see something I was exposed and vulnerable? I don't mean a trick exactly where my tormentor was. I mean a symbol, my heart drawn in the dust on your frantic rhythm while you're doing 70 down. I had to get out of the deserted mountain. Leaving the rig was not. I wiped it away. It was my only tool. My only weapon. Said I was probably exhausted. Abandoning it felt like surrendering my own skin. It's easy to believe. I scrambled back into the cab. In a lit office. The smell of old coffee. But they weren't the one who had to pull over alone in the dark. The familiar space was contaminated by the violation. This story I fired up the engine. I don't drive. The roar of the diesel. You hear it shattering the. And then decide for yourself what was real. I didn't have a plan. What was just a tired only a primal screaming. Ever see something you know? To stay still was to die. I don't mean a trick. As I wrenched the wheel to pull back symbol on the street, drawn in the dust on your passenger door, swept across the facade, 70 down a deserted mountain for a split second. I wiped it away. The beam illuminated a figure. Dispatch said I was probably exhausted, deep in the shadows, patterns in the road grime. It was just easy to believe that when you're safe and unnaturally thin, but they weren't the one who had to pull. My blood ran cold, alone in the dark. It hadn't been an empty knowing whatever drew. He was here. Still out there. He was watching. This story. I jammed the accelerator to the floor. the tires barking on the asphalt, and then decide for yourself what was real and what was just a tire. I didn't care where I was going, just away. Ever see something you know through a stop sign, turning on a trick like the main street? I mean a symbol, push the truck drawn in the dust on your passenger door. The town of Palisade blurred past my windows. I wiped it away, wholesome slice of Americana that now felt like a probably backdrop for my own seeing patterns in the road grind. My mind was easy to believe that when you're safe, the CBs, the phone, but they weren't the one who had to pull over. These weren't the actions of a normal stalker. Knowing whatever a normal stalker follows you. This story is the reason I don't drive. This thing, whatever it wasn't. And then decide for yourself. It was anticipating, and what was. It was like a chess master playing against a child. Ever see something you know 10 moves impossible? The rules of my world didn't apply. I mean, a symbol. This was something drawn in the dust on your passenger door. Something ancient while you're doing 70 down. I had to get back to the interstates. For all its desolation, and it came back. At least it was a straight dispatch line. Said I was probably exhausted. The tangled side streets of this town felt like easy to believe that when you're safe in a lit office. As I raced toward the on-ramp, but they weren't the one who had to pull over again. Alone this time it wasn't a call. Knowing whatever drew it was from a same unknown number. This story with trembling hands. I don't drive. I glanced at the screen. You hear it. It was a picture, and then decide for yourself what was real, grainy, and what was just a tire. But the subject was unmistakable. Ever see something? It was the cab of my truck, the driver's side. I don't mean a trick, and I was in it. I mean, a photo had been taken from a high angle, dust on your passenger door and behind while you're doing 70 down a deserted I could see the glow of the dashboard. I wiped it away, my face, and it came back. My hands gripping the steering wheel. Said I was probably exhausted. I slammed on the brakes, seeing patterns in the whole rig groaning. It's easy to believe that when you're safe in a lit office. I threw the door open, but they weren't the one who had to pull snapping over. Searching the rooftops, knowing whatever drew it was still out there. There was nothing. This story, just the star-dusted sky and the cold. You hear it, different moon, and then decide for yourself what was real possible, and what was just a tire man's. No, I would have heard it. Ever see something you know is impossible? It was as if a photographer had been. I mean, a symbol roof drawn in the dust on your passenger door. The feeling of being watched intensified into a certainty of being invaded. And it came back. Air around me felt hostile. Said I was probably this wasn't just a game of psychological patterns in a road crime. This was easy to believe that when you're safe. He wasn't just telling me he knew where I was. But they weren't the one who had to pull over. He was showing me that my physical space was meaningless. Knowing whatever drew he could get close enough to touch me. This story is the reason I don't drive. I would never even know he was there. You hear it. The laws decide for yourself what was real, proximity, and what was just a tire man's nightmare. Seemed to bend. Ever see something you know is my 22 years of experience. I don't mean a trick of the light. Useless. I mean a symbol. Knowing how to change a tire, dust on your passenger navigate a blizzard, doing 70 when faced with an enemy who could be everywhere. I wiped it away, and it came back. The thought was paralyzed. Said I was probably exhausted. I had to create patterns in the road. Dispatch. It's easy to believe that when you're safe. It was 3 in the morning. But they weren't the one who had to pull over alone in the dark. I fumbled for my phone, knowing whatever my fingers slipping on the screen. I found the number is the reason I don't drive. It rang once. You hear twice, and then decide for yourself. But it wasn't the voice of Brenda. What was just a tire night dispatcher. It was ever see something you know static is impossible. That same I don't mean a trick of the light. Whispering voice. I mean a symbol. No one's drawn in the dust on your passenger. It rasped while you're doing a chilling amusement down a deserted mountain. The line is busy. I wiped it away. He was in my phone, and it came back. He wasn't just calling me. Said I was probably exhausted. He was intercepting my calls. Patterns in the road. He had cut me off from the outside. It's easy to believe that when you're safe in a lit office. The last thread of connection. But they weren't the one who had the last possibility of help alone in the dark. Severed. I threw the phone onto the passenger seat. As if it were on fire. Is the reason the trap wasn't just the town. The trap was my truck, and then decide for yourself what was real and what was just a tire man's night. And he was on the outside. Ever see something you looking in is impossible. I don't mean a trick of the light. And I realized with a gut-wrenching dust on your passenger door, this being wasn't just 70 down from my deserted mountain pass. He was hunting me. I wiped it away. And it came back. Was the point. Dispatch the slow, said I was probably methodical dismantling of patterns in the road grind was the prize. It's easy to believe that when you're safe, idling in the middle of a dead silent street. But they weren't the one who had to trapped in a cage of my own steel and glass, knowing the interior dome light of my cab flickered. This story is the reason I don't drive. And then went out. You hear plunging me, and then decide for yourself what was real. The engine sputtered, tire man's night died. Every light on my dash went black. It was impossible. The truck was dead. I don't mean a trick of the light. All I could hear was the frantic pounding of drawn in the dust on your passenger door. Rhythmic sound 70 down a deserted soft scraping noise. I wiped it away. It was coming from the passenger side door. The sound of a single finger slowly seeing patterns in the road grind, tracing a shape. It's easy to believe that when you're safe, the silence that followed the engine's death, but they weren't the one who had to pull over alone. It was a dead air silence, knowing whatever the kind that presses in on your eardrums. This story is my Kenworth. I don't don't drive
My thundering, living,
you hear
breathing partner
and then decide
of
for
2
yourself what
decades
was real
was now
and what was just a
tired
cold
man's nightmare.
metal tomb.
Ever
I
see
was
something
blind,
you know
trapped in a
impossible?
cab? I don't
The
mean a trick
darkness
of the light.
inside as
I mean a
profound
symbol
as the night
drawn in the
outside.
dust on your passenger
All I could hear
door
was the
while you're doing
frantic drum of my
70
own
down
pulse
a deserted
in
mountain
that sound.
pass.
That's
I wiped
soft.
it away,
Rhythmic
and it
scratching.
came back.
Scrape.
Dispatch said
Scrape.
I was probably
Scrape.
exhausted.
It was slow,
seeing patterns in the
deliberate,
road grime.
and impossibly
It's easy to
close.
believe that when
it was
you're
the sound
safe
of
in a lit
fingernails
office,
dragging
but they
through the
weren't the
grit
one who
on
had
my
to pull
passenger door,
over, just
alone
a few
in the
feet
dark.
away.
My
Knowing
mind
whatever drew
refused
it
to
was
catch
still
up with
out
my
there.
senses.
This story
I was frozen.
is the reason every
I don't
muscle
drive
locked.
anymore.
I wanted
You
to
hear it,
scream
and then
to
decide for
smash
yourself
the window,
what was real,
to do something
and what was just
but
a
a
tired
primal
man's nightmare.
animal terror.
Ever
had
see
seized
something
me.
you know
This
is
wasn't a trick
impossible?
anymore. I don't mean a
This
trick
wasn't
of
a
the
display
light.
of power.
I mean a symbol.
This was contact.
Drawn in the dust.
The thing
on your
that had been a
passenger
whisper
door
on the
while you're
radio,
doing 70
a ghost on
down
my
a
phone,
deserted
was
mountain
now
pass.
physically
I wiped it
touching my
away,
truck.
and it came
was
back.
right there.
Dispatch
On the other
said I was
side,
probably
a thin
exhausted
sheet of
seeing
metal and
patterns
glass.
in the road grime.
My breath hitched.
It's
caught
easy
on my
to believe
chest.
that when you're
I
safe
strained my
in a lit
ears
office.
listening,
But
the
they weren't the
scraping
one who
stopped.
had to pull
For a
over
long moment,
alone
there was
in the
nothing.
dark.
Just the
knowing
ringing in
whatever
my
drew it
ears
was still out there.
I slowly,
This story is
cautiously
the reason
turned
I
my
don't drive
head,
anymore.
trying to peer
You
through
hear
the
it,
passenger
and
window,
then decide for
into the
yourself what was
blackness.
real.
I
and
saw
what was
nothing
just a
but my
tired man's
own
nightmare.
faint reflection.
Ever see
A
something
pale,
you know,
wide-eyed
impossible?
ghost in the glass.
I don't mean a trick of the light.
Then a
I mean
new
a
sound
symbol
began.
drawn
A
in the
soft,
dust on your
wet
passenger
thud
door
against the window.
while you're doing 70
Thump.
down
A pause.
a deserted mountain
Thump.
pass.
Another
I wiped
pause.
it away.
Thump.
And it came back.
It was the sound
Dispatch
of a forehead
said I was probably
gently
exhausted,
knocking against the glass,
seeing patterns in
right
the
at my
road
level.
grime.
It was
It's
a
easy to
gesture that
believe
was
that
almost
when you're
polite
safe in a lit office,
and impossibly
but they weren't the
gentle
one who had to
inquiry.
pull over.
Are you in there,
alone
Frank?
in the dark?
I recoiled,
knowing whatever drew it
scrambling
was still out
sideways in
there.
my seat.
This story
pressing
is the
myself
reason
against the
I don't
driver's
drive
side
anymore.
door as if I could
You
melt
hear
through
it,
it.
and then
My mind
decide
was
for yourself
screaming.
what was real.
This is not
and
happening.
what was just a tired
This is a
man's
dream.
nightmare.
A fatigue
Ever see
induced
something you know
hallucination
is
But
impossible?
the cold dread
I don't mean a trick of the
coiling
light.
in my gut.
I mean
knew
a
better.
symbol.
This was
drawn
real.
in the dust on
I
your
had to get
passenger
help.
door.
The
while
phone
you're
was
doing
compromised.
70
The
down
CB
a
was
deserted
dead.
mountain pass.
My only hope was
I
another
wiped
person.
it away.
A
And it
real,
came back.
flesh and blood
Dispatch
person.
said I was
I fumbled
probably
for the driver's
exhausted,
side door handle,
seeing patterns
my
in the road
fingers
grime.
clumsy with
It's easy
panic.
to believe
I
that
had to
when
get
you're
out.
safe in a
I had to
lit
run.
office. Maybe I
But
could
they weren't
break
the one
into
who
one
had
of
to
the
pull
houses,
over,
find a
alone
landline,
in the dark,
scream,
knowing
until
whatever
someone
drew
woke
it
up.
was still out
It was
there.
a desperate,
This story
stupid plan,
is the reason,
but it was
I
the
don't
only
drive
thing
anymore.
my terror-addled
You hear
brain
it,
could
and then
produce.
decide for yourself
Just
what
as
was
my
real
fingers
and
closed
what was
around
just
the
a
tired
cold
man's
metal of the
nightmare.
latch.
A
Ever
voice
see something
spoke.
you know,
Not
is
the whisper from the
impossible?
radio.
I don't mean a trick
Not
of
the
the
rasp
light.
on the phone.
I mean a
This
symbol
voice was
drawn
inside
in
the
the
cabin.
dust on your passenger door.
It was a
while
calm,
you're doing
conversational
70 down
tone,
a
and
deserted
it came from the
mountain
passenger
pass.
seat.
I wiped
right
it
next to
away.
me. And it
I
came
wouldn't
back.
do that if I were
Dispatch
you.
said
I
I was
screamed.
probably exhausted,
raw,
seeing
ragged
patterns
sound
in the
torn
road
from the
grime.
depths of my soul.
It's easy to believe
I threw
that when you're
myself against
safe
my
in a
door,
lit office,
my head
but they weren't the
swiveling
one who had to
wildly.
pull over
In the pitch blackness
alone
of
in
the
the
dark.
cab.
I could see
knowing
nothing,
whatever drew it
but I
was
could
still
feel a
out there.
presence there.
This story
Stillness.
is the reason
A
I don't
weight in the
drive
space
anymore.
beside me.
You hear it,
where there should have
and then
been
decide
nothing
for yourself
but
what
an
was
empty
real
seat.
and what was just
For
a
you.
tired man's
I choked
nightmare.
out. My voice
Ever
a
see
broken
something you
whisper.
know?
Just
is
a traveler.
impossible?
The voice
I don't mean
replied.
a trick of the light.
Smooth
I mean a
as
symbol
polished river
drawn in the
stone.
dust on
Like
your
you.
passenger door.
Though my
while you're
road
doing
is
70
much longer
down
than
a
yours.
deserted mountain.
My eyes
pass.
started to adjust.
I wiped it away.
The faint
and it came back.
ambient starlight
Dispatch said I was
filtering into
probably
the
exhausted,
cab began to
seeing
give shape
patterns
to
in
the
the road
darkness.
grime.
I could
It's
just
easy
make
to
out a
believe
form
that when
in the
you're
passenger
safe in a
seat.
lit office.
It was tall and
But they weren't the
slender,
one who had to pull
impossibly
over,
so,
alone in the
folded
dark,
into the seat,
knowing
like a stick
whatever
insect.
drew it was still
It
out
wore
there.
dark.
This story
simple
is the
clothing,
reason
but its
I don't
skin,
drive anymore.
its skin was
You
pale,
hear it,
almost
and then decide for
luminous
yourself
in the
what was
glow.
real.
I couldn't
and what
make
was
out
just
its
a tired
face,
man's nightmare.
which was lost.
Ever
in a
see
pool
something
of
you
deeper
know
shadow.
is impossible?
What do you want?
I don't mean a trick
I
of the light.
managed my
I mean
body,
a symbol
trembling,
drawn in the dust on your
uncontrollably.
passenger door.
The apples,
while you're doing
the
70
truck.
down
Take it.
a deserted
Just let me
mountain
go.
pass.
A low
I wiped it
chuckle
away,
filled the cab,
and it came back.
It wasn't a sound
Dispatch
of mirth.
said I was
It
probably
was
was a dry,
exhausted,
hollow
seeing
sound,
patterns in the
like
road
stones
grind.
rattling.
It's easy
in a
to
tin
believe
can.
that when you're
Apples,
safe
the
in a
voice
lit
mused.
office.
But they weren't the one who had
Such
to pull
temporary
over,
things.
alone in
You
the
haul
dark,
fruit that will
knowing
rot.
whatever
You drive a
drew
machine
still
that
out
will
there.
rust.
This
I
story
collect things
is
that
the
are
reason
far more
I don't drive
permanent.
anymore.
I collect
You hear
stories,
it,
Frank,
and then decide
the
for
last
yourself
stories.
what was real,
The pieces
and what was
clicked
just
into
a tired
place
man's nightmare.
with horrifying
Ever see
clarity.
something you know
The
is
research,
impossible?
the knowledge
I don't mean
about
a
my
trick of
daughter's
light.
box.
I mean a symbol
impossible
drawn in the
surveillance.
dust on
This
your
thing
passenger
wasn't
door
just a stalker.
while you're doing
It was a
70
collector,
down a
a
deserted
connoisseur
mountain
of
pass.
fear. I wiped it away,
Desperation
and
gave
it
me
came
a
back.
surge of adrenaline.
Dispatch said
a
I was
lunge for
probably
the glove
exhausted,
compartment.
my
Seeing
hands
patterns in the
searching for
road
the
grind.
heavy.
It's easy to believe
that when you're
always
safe
kept
in a lit
there.
office.
It was my club.
But they weren't
my
the
only
one
weapon.
who had to pull
My
over,
fingers found the cold,
alone in the dark,
knurled metal.
knowing
I
whatever
ripped it
drew
out,
was still out
swinging
there.
it wildly
This story
in the dark
is the
towards
reason
passenger
I don't
seat.
drive anymore.
Get out.
You
I
hear
roared.
it.
And
My
decide
swing
for
meant
yourself
nothing
what was
but
real
empty air.
and what was just
the
a tired
flashlight
man's
beam
nightmare. cut a
Ever see
frantic,
something you know
bouncing
is
path
impossible?
through the cab.
I don't mean a trick of the
illuminating the worn
a symbol
upholstery of the passenger
drawn in the
seat.
dust on your
It was
passenger
empty.
door.
While
The
you're
presence
doing
was
70
gone.
down
The voice
a
was
deserted
gone.
mountain pass.
Relief washed
I
over
wiped
me
it away
for a half second
and it came back
before being replaced
Dispatch
by a
said I
new,
was probably
more
exhausted,
profound dread.
seeing patterns
Where'd it
in
go?
the road grind.
My eyes fell on my
It's
side
easy to
mirror.
believe that when
A
you're
flicker
safe
of
in a
movement.
lit office.
I leaned
But they weren't
closer
the
to
one
the
who had to
window,
pull over,
peering into the
alone in the
gloom
dark,
of the street,
knowing
behind me.
whatever drew
A
it
police
was
car
still
was
out there.
pulling up. This
Its
story
lights
is
off,
the reason
coasting
I don't
to stop
drive
about
anymore.
50 feet
You
behind
hear
my
it,
rig, and then decide
Two
for yourself
officers were
what was
getting out.
real
For
and
a
what was just a
heartbeat.
tire man's
I felt a
nightmare.
surge of pure,
Ever see something
unadulterated
you know is
hope.
impossible?
They were here.
I don't mean a trick
They
of
would
the
save
light.
me.
I mean,
I was
a
about to
symbol
throw my door
drawn
open
in the
and
dust
run
on your
towards
passenger
them,
door,
screaming
doing
for help.
70
Then the
down
dome
a
light
deserted
in their
mountain
patrol
pass.
car
I
flickered
wiped it
on
away
as they shut
and it
their
came
doors.
back.
In the
Dispatch
brief
said I was
stark
probably
illumination,
exhausted,
I saw their
seeing
faces.
patterns in the
They
road
weren't looking at
grind.
my truck.
It's easy
They
to
were looking at
believe
each
that
other.
when you're safe
and
in a
they
lit
were
office.
smiling.
But they
Wide,
weren't the one who had to
predatory
pull
smiles.
over.
And on the
alone
side
in
of their
dark,
patrol car,
knowing whatever
gleaming
drew
under
it
the
was still
streetlight,
out there,
was the
this
official
story is the
emblem
reason
of the
I
town
don't
of
drive
Palisade.
anymore.
Beneath
You hear
the
it,
town's name,
and then decide for
almost
yourself
too
what was
small
real
to see,
and what was just
a
a tire
painted
man's
symbol.
nightmare.
An hourglass.
Ever see
lying
something
on
you
its
know
side is impossible.
The sight of that symbol
I don't mean
on
a
the
trick of the
patrol
light.
car.
I mean
Door
a
hit
symbol
me
like a
drawn in the
physical blow.
dust on your passenger
The last
door
flicker of
while you're
hope in my
doing
chest
70
wasn't
down
just
a deserted
extinguished.
mountain pass.
It was ripped
I wiped
out
it away
and stomped
and it
into
came
the
back.
ground. These weren't
Dispatch said I was
saviors.
probably exhausted.
They were part of it.
Seeing
The town,
patterns in the road
the cops,
grind. They were
it's
all
easy
part
to
of the way.
believe that when
The
you're safe
realization
in a
was
lit
so
office.
profound,
But they weren't the one
so
who had to
devastating
pull over
that
alone
almost
in the dark,
drove the air from
knowing
my
whatever
lungs.
drew it was
The
still out there.
unreliable ally
This story
wasn't
is
just
the reason
unreliable.
I don't drive
They were the
anymore.
welcoming committee
You
for
hear
my
it,
own damn
and then decide for
execution.
yourself what was
I dug
real
down below
and
the
what was
window
just a
line.
tire man's
My heart,
nightmare.
a frantic trip
Ever see
hammer.
something you know
The false hope
is
curdled
impossible?
into pure
I don't mean a trick of the light.
acid terror.
I mean a symbol
They hadn't seen me
drawn
yet.
in the dust
Or
on
maybe
your
they
passenger
had.
door.
Maybe
while
this
you're
was
doing
all
70
part of the
down
show,
a deserted
a
mountain
performance
pass.
for an audience.
I
of
wiped it
one.
away.
The
And it
smiling
came back.
cops, the slow,
Dispatch said I was
silent
probably
approach.
exhausted.
It was all
seeing
designed to
patterns
break
in
me,
the road grind.
piece by
It's
agonizing
easy to
piece.
believe that when you're safe
I could hear
in a
their
lit
boots
office,
crunching on
but
the
they weren't the
pavement,
one who had to
a
pull
steady,
over,
unhurried
alone in the
rhythm.
dark.
They weren't
knowing
rushing.
whatever drew.
They knew I
it
was
still out
trapped.
there.
My mind
This
raced.
story is the
truck
reason
was dead.
I don't drive
The
anymore.
town was hostile.
You hear it.
The very laws
and
of
then decide
nature
for yourself
seem
what
to have
was
been
real
suspended.
and what was just
What could
a
I do?
tire man's nightmare.
Where could I go?
My
Ever
eyes
see something
darted
you
around
know
the dark
is
cab,
impossible?
searching
I don't mean
for
a trick of the
anything,
light.
any
I mean a
tool,
symbol,
any weapon.
drawn in the
The
dust on
mag
your
light
passenger
felt
door
pathetic in
while
my
you're doing
hand.
70
What was I
down
gonna do?
a deserted mountain
Fight
pass.
two cops who were
I wiped
probably
it away,
not even human.
and it came back.
The stories
Dispatch
frantic.
said I was
collect the
probably
last
exhausted,
stories.
seeing
The voice
patterns
echoed in
the
my
road
head.
grind.
This wasn't
It's
about
easy to
killing
believe
me.
that when you're
Not
safe
yet.
in a lit
It was
office.
about the hunt.
But they
It
weren't
was
the
about
one who had
stripping
to
away
pull over
everything
alone
until
in the
only
dark,
raw,
knowing
primal
whatever
fear
drew
was
it was
left.
still out there.
And then
This story
and
is
the
only
reason
then
I don't
would
drive
the story
anymore.
be complete.
You hear it.
I couldn't stand
and then
the truck.
decide for yourself
It was a
what
coffin.
real.
I had
and what
one
was just a
chance,
tire
a
man's
desperate,
nightmare.
insane
Ever see
gamble.
something you know
They were
is
approaching on
impossible?
the driver's side.
I don't mean a trick of the
If I
light.
could get out the
I mean a
passenger
symbol.
door,
Maybe
drawn
I
in
could
the
use
dust
the
on your
bulk
passenger
of the
door
truck and
while you're
trailer
doing
is covered,
70
slip into the
down a
darkness
deserted
on the other
mountain
side of the
pass.
street.
I
It was
wiped
a
it
sliver
away,
of a chance,
and it came back.
but it was the only one I
Dispatch
had.
said I was probably
I crawled
exhausted,
silently across
seeing
the
patterns
cab.
in the road
My
grind.
movements
It's
clumsy
easy to believe
and
that when you're
loud
safe
in the
in a lit
suffocating
office.
silence.
But they weren't the
The
one who
passenger
had to
door
pull
was
over
my only
alone
exit.
in the dark.
My hand closed
knowing
around
whatever
the latch.
drew it was still
I took
out
a
there.
deep,
This
shaky
story
breath,
is the
held
reason
it, and
I don't
pulled.
drive anymore.
The latch clicked.
You hear
the
it,
sound as
and then
loud
decide
as
for
a
yourself what
gunshot
was
in
real
stillness.
and what was just a
I pushed the
tire
door
man's
open
nightmare.
just a crack and peered
Ever
out.
see something you
The
know
coast
is
seemed
impossible?
The
I don't mean a
street
trick
was
of the
empty.
light.
The
I mean a
orchards across
symbol
the road
drawn
were
in
a
the
wall
dust on your
of
passenger
impenetrable
door
blackness.
while you're doing 70
Perfect.
down
I
a
slid out of the
deserted
cab,
mountain pass.
my boots
I
hitting
wiped
the
it away,
asphalt with
and
a
it came
soft
back.
thud.
Dispatch
I kept
said
low,
I was probably
my
exhausted,
body pressed against the
seeing
side of the
patterns
truck.
in the road
The
grind.
cops' voices
It's
were
easy
closer
to believe believe that when you're
calm,
safe
and
and
conversational.
But they
You
weren't
check
the
the
one
cab,
who had to pull
I'll check the
over
trailer,
alone
one
in
of
the
them
dark.
said.
His voice
Knowing
was
whatever
casual,
drew it was still
as
out
if he were
there.
discussing a
This
routine
story
traffic
is the
stop.
reason I don't
didn't
drive
wait to
anymore.
hear more.
You hear
I
it,
scurried along
and then
the
decide
length
for
of the
yourself
cab,
what was real
past the
and
passenger
what was just
door
a
where the
tire
thing
man's
had just been
nightmare.
scratching. Ever see
And
something
ducked
you
under the
know
trailer.
is impossible?
The air was thick
I don't
with
mean
the
a
smell
trick
of
of
diesel
light.
and
I mean a
cold
symbol.
I moved
drawn
on my
in the
hands
dust
and
on your
knees,
passenger door,
the
while you're
gravel
doing
sliding
70
into my
down
palms
a deserted mountain
until I was
pass.
between the tandem
I wiped it
axles of
away,
the trailer.
and it came
It was a
back.
dark, greasy,
Dispatch said I was
hiding
probably
place,
exhausted,
but it offered
seeing
concealment.
patterns in the road.
From here,
growing.
I could see their
It's
feet.
easy to believe
Two
that when you're
pairs of
safe
black,
in a lit office,
polished boots,
but they weren't the
moving
one who had to
slowly on the
pull
other side of
over
the rig,
alone.
They
in the
reached
dark,
the cab. I
knowing
heard the
whatever
driver's
drew
side
it was
door
still
groan
out there.
open.
This
Clear.
story
One
is
of them
the
called
reason
out.
I don't
His
drive
partner's
anymore.
boots
You hear
continued
it
down the length
and then
of
decide
the
for
trailer.
yourself what was
He was
real
methodically
and what was just a
thumping the
tire
tires,
man's nightmare.
just as I had done
Ever
hours
see
ago
something
at the
you
Overlook.
know is
It
impossible?
was a mocking
I don't mean a
imitation
trick
of
of
my
light.
own professional.
I mean a symbol.
The boots
drawn in
stopped
the
right
dust
next to
on
my
your
passenger
hiding
door
place
while you're
I
doing
held my
70
breath, my
down
entire
a
body
deserted
rigid.
mountain pass.
I could see the
I wiped
polished
away,
toes of his boots,
and it came back.
not 5
Dispatch
feet away.
said I was probably
My heart
exhausted,
felt like it was going to explode.
seeing patterns in
Please
the
don't
road
look
grime.
under here. It's
Please
easy
just
to
keep
believe
walking.
that when you're
He did.
safe in a lit office.
Instead, he knelt
But
down.
they weren't the one
My
who had
blood
to pull
turned to
over,
ice.
alone
A
in the
hand,
dark,
clad in a
knowing
black
whatever
leather
drew
glove,
it was still out there.
came into view.
This story
Knuckles
is the reason
brushing the
I don't
pavement.
drive anymore.
He was going to look.
You hear it.
This was it.
And then
The
decide
end of
for
the line.
yourself what was
I was
real
cornered like a
and
rat
what was just a
under a
tire
wood
man's
pile.
nightmare.
But he didn't peer
Ever
into
see
the
something you
darkness.
know
His
is
hand just
impossible?
rested there on
I don't
the
mean a trick of
asphalt.
the light. And then he
I mean a
spoke,
symbol,
his voice
drawn in the
low
dust
and
on your
directed
passenger
right
door
at me
while you're doing
as if he'd
70
known I was there
down
the whole
a deserted
time.
mountain pass.
You can't run from a story.
I wiped it away,
Frank,
and it
he said
came
calmly.
back. You're the main
Dispatch
character.
said I was probably
It follows you
exhausted,
wherever you go.
seeing patterns
He was
in the
toying
road
with me.
grime. This
It's
whole
easy
chase,
to believe
this
that
whole
when you're
escape
safe in a
attempt,
lit office.
it was just another
But they
chapter
weren't the
he
one
was
who had to
letting
pull
me write.
over. He wasn't trying
Alone
to
in the
catch
dark.
me. He was
Knowing
enjoying the
whatever drew it
process
was
of me
still out
trying to
there.
get away.
This story
The betrayal
is the
was
reason
complete.
I don't drive
I had
anymore.
run from the hunter.
You hear it
right,
and then
into the
decide
arms
for
of
yourself what was
hounds.
real,
and they were
and what was just a
savoring
tire
every
man's
second
nightmare.
of my terror.
Ever see something
Then he
you
did
know
something that
is
shattered the
impossible?
last
I don't mean a
vestiges
trick
of
of
my
the light.
sanity.
I mean
He
a
stood
symbol,
up,
his
drawn
drawn
in
in
the
pivoting
dust
on
on
your
the
passenger
asphalt.
door.
He
while
wrapped
you're
his
doing
knuckles on the
70
side of my
down a
Reefer
deserted
unit.
mountain pass.
Cargo's warming up.
I wiped it away.
He called to his partner.
And it came back.
We'd better let him go.
Dispatch said I was
the client
probably
gets
exhausted,
impatient.
seeing
The other cop
patterns in the
laughed.
road grime.
Right. It's
Let
easy
him
to
run.
believe that
It's
when
more
you're
fun
safe
that way.
in a lit office.
I heard their car doors
But they weren't the
open and
one who had to
close.
pull over.
The engine
alone
started,
in the dark,
and the patrol car
knowing
pulled
whatever
away,
drew it was still out
disappearing
there.
silently
This story
down
is
the
the
street,
reason I don't
leaving me
drive
alone
anymore.
again in the
You
crushing
hear it,
darkness.
and then decide for
I lay there
yourself
under
what
my
was
trailer
real
and what
trembling,
was just a tire
my
man's
mind
nightmare.
reeling.
They
They
let
ever
me
see
go.
something you know
It wasn't an
is
escape.
impossible. It was a release.
I don't mean a trick of the light.
They had me.
I mean a
They
symbol.
knew they had me,
drawn in the
and they let
dust
me
on your
go.
passenger door.
Why?
While you're
The
doing
client gets
70
impatient.
down a
What
deserted
client?
mountain pass.
When God's name
I wiped it away.
was I hauling
and
that
it came
was more
back.
important than me.
Dispatch
I
said
scrambled
was
out from
probably
under the trailer
exhausted,
and
seeing
ran to the
patterns
cab.
in the road
I
grime.
fumbled with the key.
It's easy to
in the
believe that
ignition,
when you're safe
praying.
in a lit office.
Turn over.
But they weren't
Please,
the one
God,
who had to pull
turn
over,
over.
alone
I turned
in
the
the dark,
key. The
knowing
dashboard
whatever
lights
drew it was
flickered to
still out
life.
there.
The
This
engine
story
sputtered,
is the reason
then
I
caught,
don't drive anymore.
roaring back
You
into
hear it,
existence,
and then
as if
decide for
nothing had
yourself
ever
what
been
was
wrong.
real.
He had
and
let me
what
have
was
my
just a
truck
tire
back.
man's nightmare.
He had given me the means
Ever
to
see
run.
something you know
The game
is
wasn't
impossible?
over. He was
I don't
just
mean a trick
changing
of
the
the
rules
light.
again.
I mean
the
a
hunt
symbol
wasn't finished.
drawn in the
It was
dust
just
on your
entering
passenger
anew
door
while you're doing
more
70
terrifying
down
phase.
a deserted mountain
I wasn't
pass.
prey to be cornered.
I
and
wiped it
killed.
away.
I was
and
a
it came
delivery.
back, and I
Dispatch
realized with
said
a
I was
sickening,
probably exhausted,
gut-twisting lurch,
seeing patterns.
I
in the
wasn't
road
just
grime.
hauling the cargo.
It's easy to
I was
believe
the
that
cargo,
when you're safe,
and the
in a
final
lit
stop
office.
was getting
But
closer.
they weren't the one who had to
The
pull
engine's
over,
roar was the
alone
sound
in
of
the
a
dark,
temporary reprieve,
knowing whatever
a
drew
stay
it
of
was still out
execution
there.
granted
This
by
story
capricious
is the
God.
reason I
didn't
don't
waste
drive
a second.
anymore.
I
You
flew
hear
to
it,
Kenworth in a
and then
gear
decide for
and
yourself
peeled
what was
out
real
of that cursed
and what was
town,
just a tire man's
leaving the
nightmare.
mocking quiet of
Ever see
Palisade
something you
behind
know
me
is
My
impossible?
mind was a
I don't mean a
fractured
trick of the
mess.
light.
I mean a
Thoughts
symbol
skittering away
drawn in
like
the dust on your
cockroaches in the
passenger
light.
door while you're
I'm the
doing
cargo.
70
The
down
client
a
gets
deserted
impatient.
mountain pass.
The words
I wiped it
echoed,
away, and it
looped,
came back.
became a meaningless,
Dispatch said I was
terrifying
probably exhausted.
mantra.
Seeing
Apples.
patterns in the road.
It had to be
grime.
the apples.
It's easy to
What was in that
believe that
trailer?
when you're safe.
What was I
in a lit
hauling
office.
that this
But they weren't the
entity
one who had
and
to
its
pull
uniformed
over,
disciples
alone in the
wanted
dark,
so bad,
knowing whatever
the
drew it
immediate
was still
desperate
out
hope
there.
was that if I could
This
get
story
rid of the
is the
trailer,
reason
I could
I don't
break the
drive
contract.
anymore.
You
If I
hear
wasn't
it,
hauling the
and then decide for
package,
yourself what was
maybe the
real
deliveryman
and what was
would
just
be
a
of no
tire
more
man's
use.
nightmare.
Maybe they'd
Ever
lose
see something you
interest.
know
It was
is
a long
impossible?
shot.
I don't mean a trick of
desperate
the light,
prayer,
but
it
I
was
mean
the
a symbol
only strategic
drawn in the
thought I
dust
could
on your
form.
passenger door.
I had to
while
ditch
you're
the
doing
Reefer.
70 down.
I roared back
onto I-70.
I wiped it away,
pushing the needle
and
to
it came
80,
back.
Then 85.
Dispatch said I was probably
the truck
exhausted,
shuddered, protesting
seeing
the speed,
patterns in the
but I
road
didn't
grind.
care.
It's
I was
easy
looking
to
for a
believe
place
that when you're
any
safe
place
in
where
a
I
lit
could
office.
unhitch and
But they
run.
weren't the one who
a
had to
quiet
pull
side
over
road, alone
a
in
deserted
the dark,
rest area,
knowing
anything.
whatever drew it was.
But the
still out
highway
there.
was stubbornly
This
empty.
story is the
A
reason
straight,
I don't
black
drive anymore.
line through
You
a
hear
desolate
it,
landscape,
and then decide for yourself what was real and
the
what was
mountains
just a
were
tired
behind me
man's
now.
nightmare.
And a
Ever
vast,
see something
empty
you know
expanse
is
of the
impossible?
Utah desert.
I don't mean
was
a trick of
opening
the
up
light
before me.
I mean a symbol.
The isolation
drawn
I
in
had
the
once
dust on your
craved
passenger
was
door
now
while you're
my
doing
worst
70 down.
My
a
eyes
deserted
scanned the
mountain
horizon.
pass.
My
I wiped
knuckles
away,
aching from
and
their
it came
grip
back
on the wheel.
Dispatch
Ahead,
said I was
I saw a
probably
cluster of
exhausted,
lights,
seeing
not a
patterns
town,
in the road,
but a way
grind.
station.
It's easy to
The sign
believe
was
that
lit.
when you're safe,
All
in a lit
trucks
office,
must exit.
But they weren't the
Under
one who
normal
had to pull
circumstances,
over.
it was a
alone in the
routine
dark,
annoyance.
knowing
Tonight,
whatever drew
it was a
it
death
still
trap.
out there. I couldn't
This
stop.
story is the
I couldn't let
reason
them
I
inspect
don't
my
drive
cargo,
anymore.
my logbook.
You hear
Who
it,
knew if the people
and then
manning
decide for
were
yourself
part
what
of
was
this?
real.
The smiling cops in
in
Palisade had taught me
Ever
that
see something you
uniforms
know
meant
is
nothing.
impossible?
I had to run.
I don't mean a trick of the
blasting
light.
past
I mean
away
a symbol
station
with
drawn in the
serious
dust on your
offense,
passenger door,
guaranteed to
while you're
bring
doing
every
70
cop in a
down
50-mile
deserted
radius
mountain
down
pass.
on us.
But what
wiped it
choice
away,
did I have?
And it came back.
A speeding ticket was
Dispatch
better
said
than
I was
becoming the
probably
final
exhausted,
chapter in
seeing
someone's
patterns
collection
in
of
the
road
road
stories.
It's
As
easy
I
to
got
believe
closer,
that when you're safe,
I eased
and
my
let
foot
off
off the accelerator,
but they weren't the
ready
one
to
who had to
swerve
pull
back
over
on the main highway
alone in
at
the
the last
dark.
second.
The
Knowing
off-ramp
whatever drew
was
it was
brightly
still out
lit.
there.
A stark
This story
contrast
is the
to
reason
dark road.
I don't drive
I could see
anymore.
the scale house.
You hear it.
A small
And then
brick
decide
building
for
with
yourself
large
what was
windows.
real and
a
what was
single
just a
figure was
tire man's
visible
nightmare.
inside.
Ever
A
see
man in
something
the
you know
familiar
is
khaki
impossible?
uniform of the
I don't mean a
Department
trick of the light.
Transportation.
I mean
He
a
was sitting at a
symbol
desk,
drawn in the
backlit
dust
by
on
the
your passenger
glow of
door
computer
while you're
monitor.
doing 70
Everything looked
down
normal,
a deserted
too
mountain
normal.
pass.
My
I
instincts
wiped it away,
screamed me to
and it
forward.
came back.
But as I
Dispatch
drew level
said I
with
was
the
probably
ramp,
exhausted.
something made me hesitate.
Seeing patterns in
a
the road
flicker of
grime.
movement from
It's
the
easy
side
to
of the road,
believe that when you're
just
safe
past the
and
way
let
station
off.
entrance.
But they
It
weren't
was
the
a
one who
person
had to pull
standing
over
in the sagebrush,
alone in the dark.
A woman,
knowing
she was
whatever
waving her
drew it was
arms
still out
frantically.
This
trying to
story
flag me
is the
down.
reason I
She
don't
looked
drive
terrified.
anymore.
Her
You
face
hear it,
pale in my
and then
headlights.
decide for yourself.
She
what
was wearing
real
a tattered
and what was
waitress
just a
uniform.
tire man's
For a
nightmare.
split second, ever
I
see
saw
something
a
you
possible
know
ally.
is impossible.
Another victim
I don't mean a trick of
trapped
the
in
light.
this nightmare.
I mean a symbol.
Maybe she had escaped
drawn
from
in the dust
something
on your
in that
passenger
station,
door
while you're
Maybe
doing
she needed
70
help.
down
It was
a
the hope,
deserted mountain
that
pass.
tiny stupid
I wiped it
sliver
away,
of hope,
and it
that
came
got
back
me into this
Dispatch
mess in the
said I was
first
probably
place.
exhausted.
I made a split
seeing
second
patterns
decision.
in the road grime.
I wasn't going to run.
It's
the
easy to
station,
believe that
and I
when
wasn't
you're
going to pull
safe
in
and let off.
I was going to stop for
But they
her.
weren't the one who
I hit
had
the
to pull
brakes,
over,
slowing the rig
alone
much
in the dark,
faster than was safe.
knowing whatever
I pulled
drew
onto
it
the
was still
shoulder
out
of the
there.
interstate.
This story
Past the
is the
exit
reason
ramp,
I don't
my
drive
flashers
anymore.
clicking on.
You hear
bathing the
and
desolate
then decide for
roadside
yourself
in
what was
rhythmic
real
amber pulses.
and what was just a
I
tire
left the
man's
engine
nightmare.
running. I looked at
Ever
my
see
mirror.
something you know
The woman was
is
running
impossible?
towards me. I don't mean a
Her
trick of the
face
light.
a mask
I mean a
of
symbol
desperation.
drawn in the
This
dust
was my
on your
chance.
passenger door.
A
while
witness.
you're doing 70
Someone who could
down
corroborate
a
my
deserted
story.
mountain pass.
Someone who could tell
I
me
wiped
what
it
the
away,
hell was going on.
and it came back.
She reached the
Dispatch
passenger
said
door.
I was probably
her
exhausted,
hands slapping
seeing
against
patterns
the
in the
cold
road
metal.
grime.
She was
It's easy
sobbing,
to believe that when
gasping
you're
for
safe
breath.
in a lit office.
Please,
But
she
they weren't the
cried,
one who had to
her
pull
voice
over,
muffled by the glass.
alone in the dark.
Please, you have to help
knowing
me.
whatever drew
He's in
was
there.
still out there.
He won't let us leave.
This story
Who's
is the
in
reason
there?
I don't
I yelled
drive
through the
anymore.
closed window.
You hear it.
Who won't let you leave?
And then decide for
The
yourself what was
inspector,
real
she
and what was
wailed,
just a tire
her
man's
eyes
nightmare.
wide with terror.
Ever see
He's
something
not.
you
He's
know
not right.
is impossible?
He just smiles.
I don't mean a trick of the light.
He's been in there all night.
I mean a symbol.
And the ones who go
drawn
in
in
the
the
dust
dust
on your passenger
It was all the
door
confirmation
while
I
you're doing
needed.
70
The way
down
station
a
was a
deserted
trap.
mountain pass.
Another piece of the
I wiped
board.
it away.
This poor
And it
woman
came
was a
back,
pawn.
just
Dispatch
like that.
said I was
Get in.
probably
I yelled.
exhausted.
Quickly.
Seeing
I
patterns
reached
in the road
over,
grime.
and
It's
through
easy
the
to
passenger
believe
door
that when
lock.
you're safe,
She
in a lit
fumbled with the
office.
handle,
But they weren't the
ripped
one
the
who had to
door
pull
open
over
and scrambled
alone in the
inside,
dark, pulling
knowing
the heavy
whatever
door
drew
shut
it was
behind
still
her.
out there.
She collapsed
This
into the
story
seat,
is the reason
a whimpering,
I don't drive anymore.
shuddering mess.
You hear it.
She looked
And
young,
then decide for
maybe
yourself what was
25,
real,
with
and what was
tired
just a tire
eyes
man's
and a name
nightmare.
tag that read
Ever see
Sadie
something you
pinned
know
crookedly
is
to her
impossible?
uniform. I don't mean a
Thank
trick
you.
of the light. She
I mean a
sobbed,
symbol
clutching her
drawn
arms.
in the dust on
Thank
your
you,
passenger
thank
door
you.
while you're
It's
doing
okay. I
70
set my
down
voice
a
tight.
deserted mountain pass.
We're getting out of here. I wiped it away.
Slammed the truck
and
in
it came
gear.
back. My eyes went to
Dispatch
the mirror
said I
to
was
check for
probably
traffic
exhausted
before
seeing
pulling
patterns in the road.
And that's when I
grime.
saw it. It's easy
The
to
DOT
believe that when
officer
you're
had
safe
stepped
in
out
a
of the
lit
scale
office.
house.
But they
He was
weren't the
standing
one
under
who
the
had to
bright
pull
lights,
over,
watching
alone
us.
in the dark. He wasn't reaching for
Knowing
radio.
whatever drew it
He
was
wasn't
still
getting in
out
a
there.
vehicle.
This
He was
story
just standing
is the
there.
reason I
And he
don't
was
drive
smiling
anymore.
that same
You hear it.
wide
And then decide for
predatory
yourself
smile
what was
as
real
the cops in
and what was just a
Palisade.
tire
I
man's
stomped on the
nightmare.
accelerator.
Ever see
We had to
something
go
you
now.
know is
Hold
impossible?
on. I
don't
don't
mean
mean
a
a
trick
trick of the light.
But she wasn't
I mean a
crying
symbol
anymore.
drawn in
whimpering
the
had
dust
stopped.
on your passenger
It
door
glanced
while you're
away.
doing 70
70
She had
down
sat up
a
straight
deserted
in the
mountain
seat.
pass.
The terror
I wiped
was
it away,
gone from her face,
and it came back,
replaced by an expression
said
of
I was
serene,
probably exhausted,
placid calm.
seeing
She turned her
patterns in
head
the road
slowly
crime.
to look at me.
It's easy to
and her
believe that
eyes-
when you're safe,
her eyes
in a
were
lit office.
completely black.
But they weren't the one who
Two
had to
pools
pull
of
over
polished obsidian.
alone in the dark.
She smiled,
knowing whatever
slow,
drew it was still
terrible
out there.
smile that didn't
This story
reach her empty
is the
eyes.
reason I don't
Her
drive
voice,
anymore.
when she spoke,
You hear it,
was not
and
her
then
own.
decide for
It
yourself
was a
what
chorus
real
of voices,
and what was just
a
a
dry
tired man's nightmare.
whispering rustle.
Ever
of
see
100
something you
different
know
tongues
is impossible?
speaking as one.
I don't mean a trick of the
Silly
light.
Frank, the
I mean a
chorus
symbol
There's
drawn
no
in the
escape.
dust on your passenger
There's
door
only the
while
delivery.
you're doing 70
She reached into the
down a
pocket of her
deserted
waitress
mountain
apron
pass.
and pulled
I
out
wiped
a
it away,
small,
and it came back.
old-fashioned wooden
Dispatch
box.
said I was
the kind with
probably
painted
exhausted,
roses on the lid.
seeing patterns
She
in the
misses
road
you.
grime.
The voices
It's easy to
whispered.
believe that when
she
you're
asked us to
safe
give
in
you
a lit
this.
office.
The sight
But
of
they
that
weren't the one who
box,
had to pull
Sarah's
over
box,
alone
in the
hands
dark.
of this
knowing
thing
whatever
wearing a
drew
waitress's
still out
skin
there.
shattered
This story
the last
is the
thin
reason
barrier
I
of
don't
my
drive
composure.
anymore.
It wasn't just a threat anymore. And then decide it was a violation of something and what was just a tire. They had reached across 1,000 miles. Ever see something you know my daughter is impossible? My family. I don't mean a trick. The whispering chorus. I mean a symbol drawn in the dust on your passenger door. It was all secondary to that simple, impossible fact. I wiped her box, and it came back. Sound escaped my lips. Dispatch said I was a guttural snarl of pure, seeing patterns in the road rage. It's easy to believe that when you're safe, a cold stone in my gut. But they weren't the one who had to wrapped in a sheath of alone in the dark. My foot, whatever which had been pressing the accelerator to the floor. This story is the reason I don't drive anymore. The Kenworth bucked and screamed, and then decide for yourself. The tires locking up and sending a plume of blue smoke into the night air. Ever see something you know is impossible? The trailer I don't mean a trick of the violently around. I mean a symbol. The world outside my windshield became a spinning blur doing 70 down a deserted mountain. For a few terrifying seconds, I wiped it away. I thought and it came back. But the massive weight of the truck fought itself, seeing patterns with a final shuddering groan. It's easy to believe that slid to a halt and blocking all three lanes. But they weren't the one who had to pull over. The cab now facing back the way I'd come, knowing whatever the creature in the passenger seat didn't even flinch. This story is the reason I don't drive. Placidly holding the little wooden box, and then decide for yourself unwavering and what was just a violent, desperate maneuver. Was ever see something you know is impossible? I don't mean that box. I mean a symbol, my voice in the dust on your shaking with fury while you're doing 70 down a deserted mountain pass. The chorus of whispers. I wiped it away, and it came back. The story isn't over yet. Dispatch said I was this probably is just the part where the hero loses seeing patterns in the road. I didn't think. It's easy to believe that when you're safe, my hands reaching for the box. But they weren't the one who had to pull over. Sadie, alone in the dark, moved with a speed, knowing whatever drew it was still out. One moment it was sitting there. This story, the next the reason had shot out and clamped onto my wrist. You hear it. And the grip was like iron, was real, and what was just a tire. The skin was cold. Not the ever see something you know is impossible. I don't mean a trick of the light. I mean a symbol. The smile on its drawn in the dust on your passenger. All things in their time. While you're doing 70 down. With its other hand, it casually opened the passenger door, and it came back out onto the asphalt. Dispatch said I was still holding my daughter's box, seeing patterns. It walked a few paces away from the truck. It's easy to believe that when you're safe, my own headlights. But they weren't the one who had to pull. It held the box up for me to see in the dark. Then gently placed it on the center line of the deserted highway. This story is the reason. Come and get it. I don't drive. The voices whispered. You hear it, and then decide for yourself what was real. My escape was just a tire man's night. My gambit to find an ally. Ever see something you know is impossible. My trust had been betrayed. I don't mean a trick of the most absolute. I mean a symbol drawn in the dust on your passenger on a blocked highway doing 70 with a monster wearing the face of a frightened woman. I wiped it away using the memory of my own child. Dispatch said I was completely exhausted and utterly seeing patterns in the road. I sat there. It's easy to believe the rage and terror warring inside me. But they weren't the one who had to just stood there, waiting alone in the dark. Behind knowing whatever distance, I saw the lights of the way station. This story is the reason I don't drive back toward Palisade. You hear a set of headlights, and then decide for yourself what was real and what was just a tire. They weren't moving fast. They were approaching slowly, deliberately. I don't mean a silent procession. I mean a symbol drawn in the dust on your passenger. I looked from the approaching lights to the creature down to the small wooden box sitting in the yellow line, and it came back. A tiny, fragile piece of my I was probably exhausted, sitting in the middle patterns in the waking nightmare. It's easy to believe that when you're safe in the office, to run it over, but they weren't the one who had to pull over anything else alone in the dark. But my body wouldn't obey. Still out there. The thought of crushing that box is the reason I don't drive to my daughter. You hear was unthinkable. And then decide for yourself. It was a perfect trap, and what was just not of steel, but of love. Ever see something you know? He was right. Is impossible. This was the part of the story where the hero. I mean, a symbol. The rage in the dust on your passenger door, replaced by a 70 down, empty weariness. I had been driving for what felt like, and it came back. Running Dispatch said I was probably fighting exhausted, phantoms, seeing only to end up right back where I started. It's easy to believe facing an enemy I couldn't comprehend, but they weren't the one who had to pull over alone. My desperate gamble had knowing whatever drew it was. It had led me to an even more intimate reason I don't drive anymore. I leaned my forehead against the cold glass of the driver's side window, and what was just the engine nightmare. The headlights. Ever see something you know the impossible standoff? I don't mean a trick of the approaching vehicles. I mean a symbol closer, drawn in the beams cutting passenger through the darkness. While you're doing 70 I can see their shapes down a deserted not just patrol cars. I wiped it away. There was a tow truck, and it came back. An ambulance, dispatch, even a local news probably exhausted. An entire cast of characters. Assembled it's easy to believe that when you're stretch of highway to bear witness. But they weren't the one who had to here to help over. They were the audience. In the dark. And as I watched them pull up and form a silent, semi-circular perimeter around my jackknife rig, you hear it, and and then decide for yourself what was real and what was just a tire man's
The false sanctuary wasn't
Ever
a
see
place.
something you know?
It wasn't
is
Palisade.
impossible?
It was
I don't
the
mean a
road
trick of the
itself.
life.
This
I mean
entire
symbol
stretch of
drawn in the
I-70.
dust on your
I hadn't
passenger
found the
door
center
while
of the
you're
web.
doing 70
I'd been driving
down a
deeper
deserted mountain
and
pass.
deeper into it
I
all
wiped it
night
away,
long.
and it
This
came
desolate
back.
highway
Dispatch
wasn't a
said I was
path
probably
to somewhere
exhausted.
else.
Seeing
It was the
patterns in
destination.
the road grind.
The scene was a
It's
tableau
easy to
for
believe
fever
that when
dream.
you're safe,
My
in a lit
Kenworths
office, stalled,
but they
and
weren't the
twisted
one who
across
had to
the
pull
highway
over,
pinning
alone
me
in the
in a
dark,
cage of my own making,
knowing whatever
the
drew it
audience
was
of
still out
silent
there.
vehicles.
This story,
their
is the
headlights
reason
and ring
I don't drive
of cold.
anymore.
You hear
Unblinking
it,
eyes.
and then decide
The
for
creature
yourself what
wearing
was real
Sadie's face,
and what was just a tire
standing
man's
impassively
nightmare.
beside
Ever
the
see
little
something
wooden
you
box
know
that held
is
a piece of
impossible?
my soul.
I don't mean a trick
And
of
me,
the light.
the
I mean a
fool in the center
symbol
of it all.
drawn
This
in the
wasn't a
dust on your
trap I had
passenger
blundered
door
into.
while you're doing
This was
70
a stage
down a deserted
purpose-built
mountain
for my
pass.
despair.
I wiped it
I
away,
felt a
and
profound
it came back.
sense of
Dispatch
resignation
said I was probably
settled
exhausted,
over me,
seeing
heavy
patterns
as
in
a
the
lead
road
blanket.
grind.
The
It's
fight
easy
was
to
gone.
believe that when
The
you're
anger
safe
had
in a
burned
lit
out,
office, leaving
but they weren't
behind
the one who
only
had to
the
pull
cold
over
ashes of
alone in the
defeat.
dark. Every choice
Knowing
I had
whatever
made,
drew it was
every
still out
professional
there.
instinct
This story
I'd followed,
is the reason
I
every
don't drive
desperate
anymore.
gamble had been
You hear it,
anticipated, and then
countered,
decide for yourself
and turned
what was
against me.
real. And
I was
what
a
was just
puppet,
tire man's
and my
nightmare.
strings were being pulled
Ever
by
see
a
something you
master
know
who found
is
my
impossible?
struggles
I don't mean a
quaintly
trick of the
amusing.
light.
The creature,
I mean a symbol
Sadie,
drawn in the
tilted its
dust
head,
on your passenger
a gesture
door
of
while you're
mock
doing
curiosity.
70 down.
The
a
client
deserted
is
mountain
waiting,
pass.
frank.
I wiped
the
it away,
chorus of voices
and it came back.
whispered.
The
Dispatch
sound now
said I was
seemed
probably
to come from all
exhausted,
around me,
seeing
carried on
patterns
the
in a
cold
road
desert
grind.
wind.
It's
The
easy to
story is
believe
getting
that when
dull.
you're safe,
It needs
in
an
a lit
ending.
office.
It took
But
a
they
single
weren't the
step
one who had to
back,
pull over,
melting into the
alone in
darkness
dark,
beyond the reach of my
knowing
headlights.
whatever drew it was
leaving the
still out
box
there.
alone. in
This
the
story
spotlight.
is the reason
the message was
I don't
clear.
drive anymore.
The choice was
You
mine.
hear it, the box,
and then decide
or the
for
truck.
yourself what was
my
real
past or my
and
present.
what was just a tire
Of
man's
course,
nightmare.
there was no choice at all.
Ever see something
with a
you
side
know
that seemed to
is
drain the
impossible?
last of my
I don't mean a
strength.
trick of the light.
I killed the
I mean a
engine.
symbol
The sudden
drawn in the
silence
dust
was
on your passenger
deafening.
door.
The
while
only
you're doing
sound was the
70
faint hum
down
from the
a
Reefer
deserted
unit on the
mountain
trailer.
pass.
Still
I wiped it away,
stubbornly doing
and
its
it came
job.
back.
Keeping the
Dispatch
apples cold.
said I was probably
a bitter
exhausted,
laugh escaped
seeing
my
patterns
lips.
in the road grind.
Even at the end of the world,
It's easy to
the
believe that
goddamn
when you're
apples had to be
safe in a
kept
lit
at
office.
34 degrees.
But they weren't the one
I
who
pushed
had
the
to
door
pull
open
over
and stepped
alone
out
in
onto
the
the
dark.
asphalt.
The
Knowing
air was
whatever
frigid.
drew it was still
My
out
breath
there.
plumed
This story
in the
is the
headlight
reason
beams.
I don't drive
I didn't look at the
anymore.
ring of
You
silent
hear it,
vehicles,
and then
I
decide
didn't
for
look for the
yourself
creature
what was
in the
real
shadows,
and what was just
my
a
eyes
tire
were
man's
fixed on that
nightmare.
little wooden box.
Ever see something
it seemed
you
100
know
miles
is
away.
impossible?
Each step
I don't
I
mean a
took
trick
toward
of
it
the
felt
light.
like wading
I mean a
through
symbol
deep water.
drawn in
The
the gravel
dust
on
on
the
your
road,
passenger door
crunched
while
under
you're
my
doing
boots.
70 down
The sound
a deserted mountain
unnaturally
pass.
loud.
I wiped
knelt
away,
down on the cold
and it came
pavement.
back.
My knees
Dispatch
cracking
said
in
I was
protest.
probably exhausted.
My hands,
seeing
trembling,
patterns in the road
reached
grind.
out and closed
It's
around
easy
a
to
box.
believe that when you're
It was
safe
real
in a lit office.
The wood was smooth,
but they weren't the one who had to
painted
pull
roses
over
slightly
alone in the
faded,
dark,
just as I remember.
knowing whatever
for a
drew it
moment,
was still
just
out there.
holding it. This story
I felt a
is the
flicker of
reason
warmth,
I don't drive
a
anymore.
memory of a
You
sunny
hear it,
day,
and then
of a
decide for
daughter's
yourself
smile.
what was real.
It was a
and
cruel
what was
trick,
just a tire man's
allowing me
nightmare.
this one moment
Ever see something
of
you
genuine
know
feeling
is impossible?
before the end.
I don't mean a trick
I
of the
stood up,
light.
clutching
I mean
the
a
box to my
symbol
chest,
drawn in the
turned back to
dust
my
on your
truck.
passenger door.
My truck,
while you're doing
the blue
70
mule.
down.
22
a
years of
deserted
my
mountain
life
pass.
were poured into
I wiped
that
it away.
machine.
And
Every
it came
mile
back.
marker,
Dispatch
every
said I was
greasy
probably
truck stop,
exhausted.
every
Seeing
sunrise
patterns
in a
over a
road
new
grind.
horizon.
It's easy
It
to
was
believe
more than
that
a
when you're
rig.
safe
It
in
was
a lit
my
office.
history, my
But they weren't the
identity.
one who had
and
to
I was gonna
pull
have to leave
over
it here
alone
in the middle
dark,
of this
knowing
godforsaken
whatever
highway
drew it was still
to
out
be
there.
picked apart.
This
by these
story
ghouls.
is the reason I
I
started
don't drive
walking,
anymore.
not towards
hear
any
it,
of the waiting
and then
cars,
decide for
but
yourself
away
what was
from
real
them,
and
into
what
the
was just a
vast,
tire man's
dark
nightmare.
desert that bordered
Ever
the
see
highway.
something you know?
Let them
is
have the
impossible?
truck.
Let
I
them
don't
have
mean a
the
trick of the
apples.
light.
I had
mean
the
a
box.
symbol.
It was
drawn
a
in the
fool's
dust
bargain,
on your passenger
but it was the
door
only
while
one
you're
I could
doing
make.
70
I hadn't
down
taken
a
more than
deserted
10
mountain
steps
pass.
off the pavement.
I wiped it
when
away,
sound
and it
stopped
came
me
back.
dead.
Dispatch
Dispatch
said I
said I
was
was
probably
It
exhausted,
wasn't coming from
from my truck.
seeing patterns.
It was
in
coming from the
road
trailer.
drawing.
It's
But it
easy
wasn't
to
the
believe that when
familiar
you're safe
mechanical
in the lit
drone
office.
of the Thermo
But they
King
weren't the one who
Reefer.
had to pull over.
This was different.
Alone in the
A
dark.
deeper,
knowing
more
whatever
organic
drew it
thrumming
was still out there.
like a colossal
This story
beehive.
is the reason
I turned
I
slowly.
don't drive anymore.
The audience was
You
still
hear it,
watching,
and then decide
silent
for yourself
and
what was
unmoving.
real.
But the
and what
trailer,
was just a tire
the
man's
trailer was
nightmare.
beginning to glow.
Ever see
A
something
faint,
you know
sickly
is
green
impossible?
light was
I don't mean a
seeping
trick
from
of
the
the light.
seams around the
I mean a
sealed rear
symbol
doors.
drawn in
The
the
hum
dust
grew
on your
louder,
passenger door,
vibrating
through the
70
soles of my
down
boots.
a deserted
The
mountain
air
pass.
grew thick and
I wiped
heavy,
it away,
smelling
and it
of
came
ozone
back.
and rot.
Dispatch
like
said I was
meat
probably
left
exhausted,
too long in the sun.
seeing patterns.
The client
in the
is
road
waiting.
grind.
It's
The
easy to
apples.
believe that
It
when
was
you're
never about
safe
the
in a lit
apples.
office.
They were just
But they weren't the
camouflage.
one who had to pull
Insulation.
over. Whatever was in that trailer, whatever I had been hauling across the country,
still out there,
was waking
This
up.
story is
The
the
two
reason
heavy
I
steel
don't drive
locking
anymore.
bars on the rear
You
doors
hear it
began to
and then
rattle,
decide for yourself what was
vibrating
real
with the
and
intensity
what was
of
just a
the
tire man's
Then,
nightmare.
with a screech of
Ever see
tortured
something
metal,
you know
they
is
began
impossible?
to bend
I don't mean a
outwards,
trick of the light,
as if pushed
I mean
by
a
an
symbol
immense
drawn in the
pressure.
dust on your passenger
I
door
stared
while you're doing
mesmerized by
70
the horror.
down a
I was the
deserted
deliveryman.
mountain pass.
The Reefer
I wiped
was
it
the
away,
packaging,
and it came
and
back.
the thing inside
Dispatch
was the
said I was real
probably
cargo.
exhausted.
The client wasn't
seeing
some
patterns
person
in the road
waiting in
grind. Grand Junction.
It's easy
The
to
client
believe
was
that
right
when you're
here.
safe,
It was
in
the
lit
creature
office.
that had been
But they
hunting
weren't the
me.
one who had to
And the
pull
package
over
I was delivering
alone in the
was
dark.
something for it. To
Knowing
what?
whatever drew
Eat,
it was still
inhabit,
out there.
become.
This story
My
is the reason
exhaustion,
I don't
my
drive
despair. anymore. It
You
all
hear it,
vanished,
and then decide
burned
for
away yourself
by
what was
new,
real
more
and what was
primal
just a
terror.
tire man's nightmare.
The slow,
Ever see
psychological
something you
dismantling
know
was over.
is impossible?
The physical
I don't mean a
threat
trick of the
was
light. here.
The
I mean,
final
a symbol
chapter wasn't
drawn
about
in
my
the dust
escape.
on your passenger
It was
door
about the
while you're
arrival.
doing 70
And as the heavy
down
doors
a
of the
deserted
trailer
mountain bulged
pass.
outwards,
I wiped it away.
The metal
And
groaning
it came back
as it prepared to
Dispatch
burst.
said I was probably
knew
exhausted.
I had run out of road.
Seeing
This
patterns
was the
in
bottom.
road grind.
I was face to
It's
face
easy to
with the
believe
truth
that
of
when
my you're
cargo
safe in a lit
trapped
office,
and
but they weren't the one
helpless
who
as
had
the
to
thing
pull over.
I'd been paid to
alone in the
transport
dark was about to be
knowing
born into
whatever
the world.
drew it was
The
still
groaning
out
of the
there.
trailer doors
This story
was the most
is the
obscene
reason I don't
sound
drive anymore
I'd ever heard.
You hear it.
It was the
And then
sound of a
decide for
promise
yourself
being
what was
broken.
real
The
and what was
promise
just
of
a tire
steel
man's
and
nightmare.
engineering.
Ever see
of
something you
mundane
know
reality
is impossible?
itself.
I don't
The
mean a
sickly
trick of the
green
light.
light. I mean a
pulsed with the
symbol
deep
drawn
thrum,
in the dust,
turning
on
the
your
whole
passenger door
53
while you're
foot
doing
box
70
into a
down
monstrous
deserted mountain pass.
glowing cocoon.
I wiped it away.
My mind,
and it came back.
stripped raw by
Dispatch
exhaustion
said I was
and
probably
terror,
exhausted.
was finally
seeing patterns in the
blessedly
road
clear.
grime. There was no
It's
more
easy to
room
believe
for
that when you're
speculation
safe
or
in a lit
fear
office.
of the unknown. But they weren't
The
the one who had to
unknown was
pull
right in
over,
front of me,
alone in the dark,
about to tear its way
knowing
into the
whatever
world.
drew it was
And I was
still
the
out there.
idiot who had chauffeured
This story
here.
is the
I
reason
stood frozen
I don't
for a
drive
heartbeat.
anymore.
Clutching
You hear it,
Sarah's box
and then
to my
decide
chest.
for yourself what
This
was
little
real
piece of my
and what was just a
past.
tire man's
My
nightmare.
reason for
Ever see
capitulating
something you know
suddenly
is
felt
impossible?
different in my hands.
I don't mean a trick of the light.
It wasn't just a
I mean
symbol,
a symbol
of my daughter
drawn in
it was
the
a
dust
symbol
on
of the
your passenger
world
door
while you're
this
doing
thing was
70
trying to
down
unmake.
a deserted
A world of
mountain
painted
pass.
roses
I wiped it
and
away,
sweet
and
16
it came back.
birthdays.
Dispatch
A world
said I
that
was
made
probably
sense.
exhausted,
And in that
seeing
moment,
patterns in the
something
road
inside
grind.
me.
It's easy to
Something
believe that when
deeper
you're
than
safe
fear
in a lit
rebels.
office. My
But they
eyes
weren't the
darted
one who
around
had to
scene.
pull over,
The audience of
alone in
ghouls.
the dark,
The glowing
knowing
trailer.
whatever drew
My
it
dead
was still
Kenworth.
out there.
The Sadie
This story
creature
is the reason
which had
I
stepped
don't
back
drive
into the
anymore.
light.
Its
You
black
hear it,
eyes
and then
fixed
decide
on the
for yourself
impending
what was
birth.
real.
Its
and
face
what was just
wrapped
a
with
tire man's
anticipation.
nightmare. It was waiting
Ever
for its
see
prize.
something you know
My
is
eyes fell
impossible?
back to the box.
I don't
in
mean a
my
trick of the
hands.
light.
It was
I mean a
light.
symbol
Too light.
drawn in the
My daughter
dust
had
on your
kept
passenger
letters in
door
it
while you're
photos,
doing 70
little
down
trinkets.
a deserted
It should have
mountain
had some
pass.
heft.
I
It
wiped
was
it
a
away,
flicker, and it
The
came
timing,
back. Previously
Dispatch
ignored
said I was
detail.
probably exhausted.
Why get to me?
Seeing
Why
patterns
use this
in the road
specific
grind.
object as bait?
It's easy to believe
It wasn't
that
just
when you're
cruelty
safe in a lit office.
Everything this entity
But they weren't the one who
did
had to
was
pull
precise
over,
delivery.
alone in the dark.
It was a message,
knowing whatever
a piece of a
drew
story.
was still out
She
there.
misses you.
This story
She asked us to
is the
give you
reason
this.
I don't
It was a
drive
lie.
anymore.
My daughter
You
would
hear it,
never give
and
this
then
box
decide
to
for
a
yourself
monster.
what was real.
The creature
and what
hadn't
was just
taken
a
the
tire
box from
man's
her.
nightmare.
It had recreated.
Ever see something you
It
know
had built this
is impossible?
perfect replica.
I don't mean a trick
from
of the
my
light.
own memories.
I mean a symbol
pulling the image
drawn
right
in the
out of my
dust on
head.
your passenger
It knew
door
what the box
while you're
looked
doing
like, but it
70
didn't know what it
down
felt
a
like.
deserted mountain
It didn't know
pass.
its weight. I wiped
And
it
if
away,
it could pull that
and it came
memory
back.
out,
What else had it
Dispatch
seen
said I was
there?
probably
My
exhausted.
mind flashed back
seeing
to a
patterns in the
conversation
road
from
grind.
years ago.
It's
A
easy to
stupid
believe
argument
that when
with
your
my
safe
ex-wife
lit
over
office.
insurance.
But they weren't
She
the
wanted
one
me
who
to
had
get
to
a bigger
pull
policy.
over,
What
alone
if something
in the dark,
happens out there, Frank?
knowing whatever
A
drew
fire?
it was still out
You're
there.
driving a
This
10,000
story
gallon
is the
fuel
reason
tank with
I
a
don't
hot
drive
engine
anymore.
bolted.
You
to the
hear
front.
it,
The
and then decide
Kenworth.
for yourself.
It didn't
what was
have
real
one fuel
and
tank.
what was just a tire
Like most
man's
rigs,
nightmare.
it had two.
Ever see
One on
something
each
you
side.
know is
150
impossible?
gallons.
I don't mean a
of
trick of the
diesel
light.
fuel each.
I mean a symbol
300
drawn
gallons
in the
total.
dust on your
A
passenger
bomb.
door.
A massive
doing 70
rolling
down a
incendiary
incendiary
deserted
bomb.
mountain pass.
The creature had seen my
wiped it
memories
away.
of the truck,
And it came
but it
back.
had only seen them
Dispatch
through
said
my
I was probably
eyes,
exhausted,
the eyes of a driver,
seeing patterns in
It
the
saw
road
the steering
grind.
wheel.
It's
the
easy to
gear
believe
shift,
that
the
when
road.
you're safe,
It
in the
understood
lit
my
office.
professional habits.
But they weren't the
my
one who had to
logbook,
pull
my route.
over
But
alone in the dark.
didn't understand the mechanics.
Knowing whatever drew
the
it was
cold,
still out there.
hard physics.
This story
of
is the
what would
reason
happen if
I don't
you
drive
introduced a
anymore.
spark.
You
to
hear it,
300
and then
gallons.
decide for yourself what was real.
It saw the
and
truck
what was
as
just a
cage,
tire man's
a
nightmare.
stage.
I
Ever
suddenly
see
saw
something
it
you
as a
know
weapon.
is impossible?
The insight
I don't mean a
didn't
trick
bring
of the
hope.
light.
It brought a
I mean a
cold,
symbol,
terrifying
drawn in the
clarity.
dust on your passenger
A new
door
kind of
while you're
resolve
doing
settled
70
in my
down
gut,
a deserted
displacing
mountain
the
pass.
despair.
I wiped it away.
I wasn't the main
and it
character
came
in
back.
its story.
Dispatch
anymore.
said I was
going to
probably
be the author of the
exhausted,
last,
seeing
goddamn
patterns in
word.
the road grind.
I looked at the creature.
It's easy to
at
believe
safety.
that when you're safe,
It was still
in a lit
focused on the
office.
trailer,
But they weren't the one who
distracted,
had to pull
like a
over,
child watching
alone
a
in the
firework,
dark,
waiting
knowing
for the
whatever
explosion
drew
of
was still
color.
out there. The other
This
ghouls in
story
their cars
is the
were
reason
same.
I don't drive
Their
anymore.
attention locked on the
You
main
hear
event.
it.
And
This
then
was my
decide
only
for yourself
chance.
what was real.
I took a step
and what
back,
was just a tire
then
man's
another,
nightmare.
melting
Ever
into the
see
darkness
something
at
you
the
know
edge of the
is
road,
impossible?
away from
I don't
the
mean a
direct
trick of the
glare
light.
of the headlight.
I mean a symbol.
I moved
drawn in
slowly,
the dust on your
deliberately,
passenger door,
not
while
running,
you're doing
just
70
fading
down.
The creature
a deserted
didn't
mountain
notice.
pass.
Its focus
I
was
wiped it away,
absolute,
and it came
I
back.
circled around,
dispatch,
using
said
the
I was
ditch along
probably
the side of the
exhausted,
highway for
seeing
cover.
patterns in
My
the
heart
road
pounding a rhythm.
It's easy
of
to believe
pure,
that when you're
desperate
safe in a
adrenaline.
lit office.
I needed to get to
But
the
they weren't
driver's
the
side
one
of
who
my
had to
cab.
pull over.
I crept along the
alone in
line
the
of
dark,
silent,
knowing
watching
whatever
cars.
drew it was still
The
out
occupants
there.
just
This
stared
story
straight
is the
ahead.
reason
Their
I don't
faces
drive
blank.
anymore.
Their
You
eyes
hear it,
fixed on
and
the
then
glowing
decide for
trailer.
yourself what was
They paid me
real
no mind,
and what was just
I was
a
a ghost
tire
at my
man's
own
nightmare.
funeral. I reached
Ever
my
see
rig.
something you
the
know
engine
is
block still
impossible?
warm.
I don't mean
the
a trick
driver's
of the
door
light.
was still ajar.
I mean a symbol
silently,
drawn in the
I
dust
slid back
on
into
your
the
passenger
cab.
door.
The
while
key
you're
was
doing
still
70
in ignition.
down a
The
deserted
air was
mountain
thick
pass.
with the smell of
I wiped it
ozone.
away.
The thrumming
from
from
the
the
trailer
trailer
was so
Dispatch
intense.
said I was
now
probably
the whole
exhausted,
cab was
seeing
vibrating.
patterns in the
metal
road
of the
grind.
doors was
It's
starting
easy to
tear.
believe that
I
when
didn't
you're
try to
safe
start the
in a
engine.
lit office.
I just turned the key
But they weren't
to
the one who had to
position.
pull over.
The dashboard
alone
lights
in the
didn't
dark.
flicker this time.
Knowing
They
whatever
came
drew
on
it was still
steady
out
and
there.
bright.
This
He had
story
given me
is the
back
reason
control
I
of the
don't
truck's
drive
electronics.
anymore. You
A
hear
fatal
it.
mistake.
And then decide
My
for
hand
yourself
went to the
what was
console
real
to a
and what
small,
was just a tire
unassuming
man's
switch
nightmare.
I'd had
Ever
installed
see
years
something
ago.
you know
It was for a set of
impossible?
aftermarket
I don't mean a trick of the
floodlights
light.
on the back
I
of
mean
my
a symbol
cab,
for hooking
drawn
up
in
a
the
trailer
dust
in
on
the
your
dark.
passenger door.
But the
while you're
wiring
doing
was
70
frayed.
down a
I
deserted
knew it
mountain
sometimes
pass.
through a spark.
I wiped
I looked
away,
out the passenger
and it
window.
came back.
This Sadie
Dispatch said I was
creature had
probably
moved
exhausted,
closer to the trailer
seeing
doors.
patterns in the
its
road
head
grind.
tilted.
It's
as
easy
if
to
listening
believe
to
that
a
when you're
whisper
safe
from within
in
a
a lit office.
It was right between
But
my
they weren't the
cab
one who
and
had to
trailer.
pull over.
Perfect.
Alone in
My
the dark.
hand hovered over the switch.
knowing whatever drew
This
it
was
was
it.
still out
The
there.
final gamble.
This story
There would be
is
no
the reason
walking away
I
from
don't
this.
drive anymore.
My story
You
wasn't
hear
going
it,
to end with
and then
me
decide for
driving
yourself
off
what was
into the
real
sunrise.
and what was just a
It was going to
tire
end
man's
right
nightmare.
here in fire.
Ever see
and
something
thunder
you know is
on a
impossible?
forgotten stretch?
I don't mean
of
a trick of the
I-70.
light.
I took
I
one
mean a
last
symbol
look at the little wooden
drawn in the
box
dust on your
sitting on the
passenger
passenger
door
seat
while you're doing
my real
70
life,
down
my
a
real
deserted
story.
mountain pass.
This chapter is
I
mine.
wiped it away.
I whispered,
and it came back,
and I flicked the
Dispatch
switch.
said I was
For a
probably
split second,
exhausted.
nothing happened.
Seeing patterns
The
in
world
road
held its
grind.
breath.
It's easy
The
to
sickly
believe that
green
when you're
light from the
safe
trailer
in a lit
pulsed.
office.
The
But they weren't the
thrumming
one who
reached
had to
a
pull
fever
over,
pitch,
alone
and
in
the
the
rear
dark,
doors began to rip
knowing
from
whatever
their hinges.
drew it was still
The
out
Sadie
there.
creature took
This
a step
story
forward,
is the reason I
raising
don't
its
drive
arms
anymore.
in a gesture
You hear
of
it,
welcome.
and then
in that
decide for
frozen
yourself
moment,
what was real.
I saw it
and
all
what
with
was just a
perfect,
tire man's
terrible
nightmare.
clarity.
Ever
The
see
audience
something
in
you
their
know
cars
is
a
impossible?
monster in its
I don't mean a
moment of
trick of the
triumph.
light.
I mean a
Me,
symbol,
the architect
drawn in
of
the
the
dust on your
apocalypse.
passenger door.
Then came the
while you're
spark.
doing 70
It wasn't a
down
flicker.
a deserted
It was an
mountain pass.
angry,
I
brilliant
wiped it away,
flash from the
and it
frayed
came back.
wiring near the
Dispatch
driver's side
said I was
fuel
probably
tank.
exhausted.
The hissing sound
Seeing
that followed
patterns
was
in the road
almost
grind.
too quiet
It's
to
easy
hear.
to believe
the
that
sound
when
of
you're
a
safe in
pinhole
lit
leak in the
office.
tank.
But they
I
weren't the
hadn't
one who had
noticed.
to pull
A
over.
tiny flaw of the
alone in
creature
dark,
in its omniscience
knowing
had
whatever
overlooked.
drew it was
The
still
fine
out there.
mist of
This
diesel
story
fuel
is the reason
leaking for
I don't
God
drive
knows how
anymore.
long.
You hear
had
it,
soaked the
and then
undercarriage
decide
of my
for
rig,
yourself what was
turning
real
the entire
and what was just
chassis
a tire
into a
man's
giant
nightmare.
wick.
The
Ever
spark
see something
ignited
you
the
know
vapor.
is impossible?
The fire didn't
I
start.
don't mean a trick of
it
the
was
light.
born.
I mean
a
a
whoosh
symbol
of blue
drawn
and
in the
orange
dust on your
flame
passenger
erupted
door
from
while
beneath
you're
my
doing
cab,
70 down
instantly
a deserted
engulfing the
mountain pass.
massive fuel
I wiped it
tank.
away.
The heat
and it came
was
back.
instantaneous.
Dispatch said I was
and
probably
violent.
exhausted.
The air
seeing
in the cab
patterns in the
turning
road
to a
grind.
furnace.
It's easy
The
to believe
windows
that when you're
crazed
safe in a lit
and then
office.
blew inwards.
But they
in a
weren't the one who had to pull
superheated
over.
glass.
Alone
The
in the
Sadie
dark,
creature turned,
knowing whatever
its look
drew it
of
was still
rapturous
out there.
anticipation.
This story is the
twisting
reason
into something
I don't
like
drive
surprise.
Its
You hear
black
it,
eyes
and then decide
widening
for
as the
yourself what
wall
was
of
real
fire roared
and what was
towards
just a
it.
tire
It
man's
never had a
nightmare.
chance to scream.
Ever see
The
something
fireball
you know
consumed
is impossible?
it.
The
I
waitress
don't mean a trick of the
uniformed
vaporizing,
a symbol
drawn in the
inhuman
dust
form
within silhouetted
while you're
for a
doing
microsecond
70
before
down
dissolving into incandescent ash. I wiped it away. The flames
came back.
starved for air.
Dispatch
Said I was
shot
probably
sideways.
exhausted. A
Seeing
horizontal
patterns in
jet
the road
of
grind.
pure destruction.
It's
that
easy to
slammed
believe that
into
when
the
you're
glowing
safe in
trailer.
the lit office.
What happened next?
But they weren't
was
the
not
one
an
who had to
explosion.
pull over.
It was a rupture.
Alone in the dark.
The superheated
Knowing
fire
whatever drew
hitting
it
the
was still
alien
out there.
energies of the Reefer.
This story is the
created
reason
a reaction
I don't drive
that
anymore.
defied physics.
You hear it,
the sickly
and then
green
decide
light
for yourself
and the
what was
roaring
real
orange
and
flame
what was just a
clashed.
tire man's nightmare.
And for a moment,
They
ever
seem
see
to
something
cancel
you
each
know
other out,
is impossible,
creating a
I don't mean a
sphere
trick
of
of the light.
absolute,
I mean a
silent
symbol
blackness
drawn in
around
the
the
dust
trailer.
on your passenger
Then,
door while
the
you're
sphere
doing
imploded with a
down
sound
a
that
deserted
wasn't a
mountain
bang,
pass.
but a deep,
I wiped it away,
gut-wrenching
and it
tear.
came back. It was the sound of
Dispatch said
reality.
I was probably
ripping
exhausted
at the seams.
seeing patterns
The
in
trailer
road
didn't
grime.
explode.
It's easy to
outwards.
believe that
it
when you're
collapsed
safe
in on
in a lit
itself.
office,
Crushed
but they
into
weren't
a
the one who had to
screaming
pull
knot
over
of metal
alone in the
light
dark,
by forces I couldn't
knowing
name.
whatever drew
The
it was
shockwave
still
that
out there.
followed was not
This
of
story
pressure,
is the reason
but of
I don't
pure
drive
rawness.
anymore.
It
You
washed
hear it,
over the audience,
and then decide for yourself what was real
and they didn't
and
blow
what was
away.
just a tire man's nightmare.
They simply ceased to be.
Ever see something
One
you
moment
know
they were
is
there,
impossible?
a ring
I don't mean
of
a trick of the
watchers.
light.
The next,
I mean a
they
symbol
were gone,
drawn
leaving
in the dust
behind
on your passenger
only
door
shimmering
while you're
heat
doing
devils
70
on the empty
down
asphalt.
a deserted mountain.
The cab of my
pass.
truck was an
I
inferno.
wiped it away.
The seat
And it
was
came
on
back.
fire. My
Dispatch
clothes were on
said I was
fire.
probably exhausted.
My skin was on fire.
Seeing patterns
The pain
in the
was
road
blinding.
It's
absolute,
easy to
but
believe
my
that
mind
when
was
you're
still
safe in a
coldly,
lit office.
terrifying.
But they weren't the one who had to pull
I had
over
done it.
alone
I had
in the
won.
dark.
A Pyrrhic
knowing
victory
whatever drew it was
written
still
in
out
flames.
there.
This
And
story
my
is the
own
reason
immolation.
I don't drive
With the last
anymore.
of my strength,
You hear it,
driven by an
and then
instinct
decide for
I didn't
yourself
know I
what was
possessed,
real
and
I
what was just
kicked
a tire
open the
man's
buckled
nightmare.
driver's door.
Ever see
fell
something
out
you
onto the
know
burning
is
asphalt.
impossible?
I
don't mean a
rolled,
trick of the light.
trying to smother the
I mean a
flames that were
symbol
consuming
drawn
me.
in the dust
My
on your
world of
passenger door
vortex
while
of
you're doing
agony
70
and the roaring
down
of the
a
fire.
deserted mountain
I
pass.
crawled. I wiped
dragging
away,
myself away
and it came
from
back.
the epicenter.
Dispatch
away
said I
from
was
the pyre
probably
of my
exhausted
truck and the ghost
seeing
of the
patterns
tire
in the road.
I didn't get far before
It's
my
easy to
strength
believe
gave
that when
out.
you're safe,
I
in the
collapsed onto
office.
the gritty shoulder.
But they weren't
of
the
road.
one who had to
the
pull
world
over
swimming
alone
into
in
a
the dark,
blurry, gray
knowing
haze.
whatever drew it was
I
still
lay
out
there. My
This
body
story
ruined.
is the reason
watching
I
the
don't drive
blue mule
anymore.
burn against
You
the
hear it,
backdrop of the
and then
dawning
decide
sky.
for yourself what was
the fire
real
was
and
already
what was just a
dying
tire
down,
man's nightmare.
having consumed
Ever see
all
something
the
you
fuel,
know is
leaving
impossible?
behind the black.
I don't mean a trick of the light.
skeletal remains.
I mean a
of my
symbol
life.
drawn in
The
the
silence
dust on your
that
passenger
descended
door
was
while
profound,
you're doing 70
broken
down
only
a
by the
deserted
crackle
mountain
of
pass.
cooling metal.
I wiped it
and
away,
the wind,
and it came
whispering
back.
across the
Dispatch
empty desert.
said I was probably
I don't know how long
exhausted,
I lay there,
seeing patterns
an
in
hour,
the road grind.
a day. It's
Eventually,
easy to believe that
the
when
real
you're
world
safe
found
in a lit
me.
office,
A state trooper,
but they weren't the one
a
who had to
real
pull
one this
over
time,
alone
his
in
face
the
a
dark,
mask of shock,
knowing
and
whatever
disbelief.
drew it was still
An
out there.
ambulance.
This
The
story
sanitized
is the reason
smell of
I don't drive
antiseptic
anymore.
and the mumble,
You hear it,
confused
and then decide for
voices of
yourself what
medics
was real
who couldn't
and what was
understand
just
the
a
nature
tire
of my
man's
burns.
nightmare.
They didn't see
Ever
the traces
something
of
you
green
know
is
is
scorch
impossible?
marks. I don't mean a
I
trick of the
survived.
light.
That's
I
the
mean
part
a
that
symbol
feels like the biggest
drawn in
lie.
the dust on your
The doctors
passenger
called it a
door
miracle
while you're doing
The
70
investigators
down
called it a
a deserted
freak
mountain
accident.
pass.
A
I
tank
wiped
of
it away,
fire of unknown
and it came
origin.
back. They found no
Dispatch
other
said I was
wreckage.
probably
No
exhausted,
other bodies.
seeing
Just me
patterns
and the
in
charred
road
husk of
grind.
my rig.
It's easy
They
to
never
believe
found the
that
little
when you're
wooden
safe
box
in a lit
with the
office.
painted roses.
But they weren't the
I
one
can only
who had to
assume it
pull
was
over
unmade in the
alone in the
blast.
dark.
A small price to
knowing
pay.
whatever drew
I
it
left
was
the
still out
hospital
there.
with more scars
This
on my
story
soul
is the
than on my
reason
skin.
I don't drive.
I never drove a truck again.
You hear it.
I couldn't.
And then
The
decide
low
for
hum of
yourself
a diesel
what was real
engine
and
sends a
what was
jolt
just a
of
tire
ice
man's
through my
nightmare.
veins.
Ever
I
see
live in a
something
small
you know
apartment
is
now,
impossible?
far from the
I don't mean a
interstate,
trick of the light.
far from the mountains,
I mean a
and
symbol
the deserts.
drawn in the
I
dust
keep the
on your
curtains
passenger
drawn,
door
but
while
the
you're
story
doing
isn't
70
over.
down.
That's
a
the
deserted
real
mountain
horror.
pass.
I won the battle.
I wiped it away,
but I know,
and it came
with
back.
a certainty that
Dispatch
shows me
said
to
I was
the bone
probably
that
exhausted.
the war is far
seeing
from over.
patterns in the road.
The collector of
grind.
stories is
It's
not
easy to
so
believe that when
easily
you're
defeated.
safe in a lit
It
office.
lost a pawn, it lost
but
a
they weren't the
prize,
one
but
who
an
had to
entity
pull
like that
over
doesn't just give
alone
up.
in the dark.
Sometimes,
knowing
late at
whatever
night,
drew it was
when the
still
city
out
is
there.
quiet, I
This
hear
story is
a
the
faint
reason
whisper
I don't
on the
drive
wind,
anymore.
like the
You
hiss
hear
of a
it,
faraway
and then
radio.
decide for yourself.
And
what
every
was
now
real
and then,
and what was just
I'll
a tire
see something
man's
out of the
nightmare.
corner of my eye.
Ever see something
a flicker
you
of
know
movement
is
in a dark
impossible?
alley. I don't mean
the
a trick
glint
of
of
the light.
something in the dust.
I mean a symbol
on a neighbor's
drawn
car
in the
door.
dust on your
It's
passenger
testing
door
me,
while you're
watching
doing
me,
70
waiting.
down. A
It's
deserted
biding its
mountain
time.
pass.
Letting me
I
write
wiped
a
it away,
few more
and it came back.
mundane chapters of my
Dispatch
life
said I was
before it
probably
starts on
exhausted
again.
because
Seeing
it knows what I
patterns
now
in the road
know.
grind.
I'm no
It's
longer
easy to
just
believe
Frank,
that when you're
the
safe
retired
in a lit
trucker.
office.
I'm a man
But they
who
weren't the one
survived.
who had to pull
I'm the
over
story that got
alone
away.
in the dark.
And a collector
knowing
can't
whatever
abide
drew
an
it was still
incomplete
out
set.
there.